Everybody, we are going to start because we are on time sort of people here. Kind of. All right. This is kind of in the tradition of this conference of taking huge issues and condensing them to 1 hour, and that's what we're going to do. Talking about how to fit tribal water development into this era where we're mostly talking about how do you reduce overall consumption in this basin. And thankfully, this topic has come up many times before in this event, so I don't feel quite so bad about only having an hour to do this. This panel, I'm not going to run this panel. Celine Hawkins is going to run this panel. She's TNC's Tribal Partnerships Program Director. She's one of the leaders. I don't know if there's what your title is within the Water and Tribes Initiative, but one of the leaders of that. I haven't seen the flow chart of titles for that. But most importantly, she's a graduate of this law school. So it's fantastic that you're back here and participating. And I'm going to let you run this panel, with an iron fist or whatever you want to do. So take it away.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you for inviting me. So I get to open this panel up with a little bit of context today, and then I'm going to pass it along to two of my friends and colleagues who are doing work in the basin. So Doug mentioned that I'm a graduate of CU Law, and while I was here, I was a student of Charles Wilkinson's. And I took a lot of classes from him, and he pushed me pretty hard. And one of the things that he pushed me on in the Colorado Plateau seminar is I was really sitting with defining a problem, and I was really resisting working on my paper coming to solutions to a problem. So I think it is fitting that almost 20 years later, I am standing here at a conference where we have largely been discussing the problem that we're facing and how challenging it is. And I am going to talk about solutions today. And I think Charles would be proud of me. It only took 19 years for me to come and be ready to talk about solutions. So we, at several points over the last couple of days, heard a little bit about the tension between the needs of the basin's 30 tribal nations to both quantify and to develop into their water supplies, and the fact that the entire basin is in the midst of a belt tightening discussion. And so the problem that we have been talking about, that supply and demand are no longer matching, and that we're forecasted for this to be a larger problem as demands go up and supply drops, is actually a much bigger problem when you think about the magnitude of tribal water in the Colorado River Basin. So this chart has not been put up, nor anything like it during this conference. This is some work that we did in collaboration with tribal nations in the Upper Basin to take a look at what percentage of the projected future depletions in the basin are in fact coming from those tribal water rights portfolios. So again, this has nothing to do with the slide about how we're going to reduce consumptive use in the basin, and is in fact about the projections for the future. And the takeaway point is that nearly half of the projected depletions in the Upper Basin, on the order of 418,000 acre feet, is water that is already decreed or is in settlements and dedicated to tribal uses, but has not yet been developed for that purpose. And so when we talk about the need to do belt tightening, we also need to talk about what this water means and the need for development. So that's sort of a scary, daunting thing to have to do after lunch. And so my request is that you stay with this panel. And my promise to you is that if we take time to unpack and address the role that tribal water is playing in the system, we will be better positioned to think about those durable solutions. And we've heard a lot today about equitable apportionment and equity. And I want to introduce some different language for us to think about today because it's hard for tribal nations at times to think about that word equitable when it comes to their water supply. So I'm going to talk about this in a frame of respect for the human and treaty rights that tribal nations hold, and also about the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. And I offer these concepts to just put a little bit of a different flavor on the concepts of equity that we've been discussing so that we can really think through what it means to have treaty-based rights in the mix of the water rights that we're talking about in the Colorado River Basin. So I will start with just a little bit of historical context. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Jenny Dumas, Leland Begay, and Lisa Yellow Eagle, who developed these slides. And I think a really important piece of historical context that we don't always discuss when we're talking about tribal water is the parallel history of federal Indian policies and the law of the river. And so we can toggle back and forth between my two slides. I think most of us in this room are really familiar with the history of the development of the law of the river. And maybe not so many of us are familiar with this parallel history of federal Indian policy. And what I really want to point out is that it's not really until the 1970s that we hit the current era of self-determination in federal Indian policy. And that is also really when you start seeing the first adjudications and settlements of tribal water in the basin. So when we think about the development of the law of the river, the agreements that we have layered and developed, the tribal quantifications come really, really late in that process. And that also means that the development of tribal water and the funding that has come into the basin to allow tribes to access their quantified water has really only come in the last 20, 30 years. And in some cases, tribal nations are still negotiating to get access to their water. So I offer that because we will often hear a little bit of tension between we need to reduce our existing consumptive uses right now, and tribal nations are saying we are just right now having the ability to access and think about developing our water. So now I'm going to turn to some context on water conservation programs in the Colorado River Basin. We are in the thick of using and developing the tools that we will need to balance the water budget in the Colorado River Basin. And so I often get the question, why aren't tribes just using our existing water conservation programs? And I have a couple of answers. One is that they do. And in fact, we have lots of examples of how tribal nations in both the upper and lower basin have already participated significantly in these programs. But their ability to do so is quite limited. And there's some pretty big hurdles for tribal nations to access and participate in those programs. Some of these are ones that could be overcome through negotiation and education. They have to do with contracting and sovereign immunity and things that we've been able to work through in some context. But the most persistent hurdle that I have seen in tribal nations being able to access these programs is in the fact that the only tradable measure that we allow in these programs currently is conserved consumptive use. And as I just explained, fitting that with tribal water rights, especially when tribal nations have not had the time and resources to develop their water, is providing not only a challenge, but really it calls the question about who does get paid and who does not get paid for water that's supporting the system. And that's not just a question of equity, that starts to be a question of consent and human rights for me. So I know this sounds really tough, but we are designing programs all over the Colorado River Basin to meet the moment that we're in. Versus, I was thinking back to 2009 when I started my tribal legal practice, and things are just very different today about how much water managers of every type in the basin know about tribal nations. There has been extraordinary work to build relationships across the basin. There have been more historic meetings in the last 2 years in the basin than there were in the previous 100 years. So I want to really acknowledge that we are in a different place today than we were even a decade ago in our work. And we are now on the brink of what might be the most important negotiation in my lifetime on the Colorado River. Right now is the time that we need to be empowering tribal nations to lead solutions throughout the Colorado River Basin. And it doesn't really matter if you're like me and you're really concerned about human rights and do no harm and what we're doing in the basin. But also, if you're just someone who cares about the survival of the Colorado River and the sustainability of the basin, you should be thinking about this too. So I invite you to listen to my colleagues who will be talking about how some of the most cutting edge work in the basin is occurring right now with tribal nations. And hopefully we'll be able to have a great discussion about this when I'm finished. Thank you so much. Am I introducing her?
You are introducing.
Well, I don't have Dominique's bio, but I don't think I really need it. Dominique is an extraordinary attorney who works and represents the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. And she is just one of the leading attorneys in the Colorado River Basin on these matters.
Well, it's going to be hard to live up to that intro, but I will try. So one thing I am not is good with technology. So bear with me. There we go. There. I got it. So in keeping with something that was said yesterday, I want to tell you a story. And I think Celine will agree with me. It's a good story. And I think Daryl will agree as well. In January of 2020, a group of representatives from the Hickory Apache Nation, the Nature Conservancy, and the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission met to discuss a concept. Could the state of New Mexico, through its Interstate Stream Commission, with the assistance of TNC, lease some water from the nation to use it for the purposes of a strategic water reserve? So now that I've given you the beginning of the story, I'm going to give you some background so you have a little bit of context. The San Juan River is one of the main tributaries to the Colorado. It flows through New Mexico. It is critical habitat to the razorback sucker and the Colorado pike minnow, that are species that are listed under the ESA and are part of a recovery implementation program. The Nature Conservancy and the ISC are interested in in helping those species recover. And to make that happen, fish spawning habitats need to be flushed out with high water in the spring, and then adequate flow is needed later in the season to maintain the connectivity between backwater habitats and the main channel. Backwater habitats are essential nursery areas for larval fish to grow before they enter the main channel. The Hickory Apache Nation has settled water rights that are enshrined by a 1992 Act of Congress. Pursuant to that settlement, the nation holds title to 33,300 acre feet of water per year. That's a depletion amount. That's a diversion amount, not a depletion amount. And the bulk of that water is held in Navajo Reservoir. Since the 1990s, most of that water has been leased to power companies for coal-powered electricity generation downstream of Navajo Reservoir. However, that industry is in decline in the Four Corners area, and the power companies abruptly canceled the lease before its term. Now let me tell you a little bit about the New Mexico Strategic Water Reserve. It's a unique construction in New Mexico law. It allows the Interstate Stream Commission to purchase or lease water rights to be used to help protect endangered and threatened species or to assist with compliance with interstate compacts. And while the water rights are in the Strategic Water Reserve, they are protected from abandonment and forfeiture. Given all this, the nation, TNC, and the Interstate Stream Commission could see the potential for a win-win situation to put this water that had previously been used for coal-powered plants to a new use, helping with compact compliance and with fish recovery. So back to that meeting in January 2022. We were pretty excited and we were hoping to get this going, and then COVID hit. So we had to learn to do everything differently and remotely. And over the course of the next 2 years, the nation, TNC, and the ISC negotiated, basically by Zoom, a lease agreement so that the ISC and TNC could lease the water for the purposes of the Strategic Water Reserve. As we discussed, those purposes are solely compact compliance and protection of threatened and endangered species, or to prevent listing of species. So pursuant to the lease, the ISC can lease up to 20,000 acre-feet a year of water from the nation every year for 10 years. The amount of water to be leased every year is dependent on the funding that is available. The price per acre foot is determined based on a sliding scale. The more water the ISC orders, the cheaper the price per acre foot. The price is also adjusted for inflation every 2 years. And the pricing mechanism that was used for the lease was based on studies of water markets in New Mexico. So there was a correlation to the fair market value of the water at the time. So we had to get a permit for a change of place and purpose and use. Implementation of this lease helps improve in-stream habitat for about 106 miles of the San Juan River in New Mexico, from Navarro Reservoir to the New Mexico-Utah state line, and it also allows for additional benefits downstream in Utah. The lease was signed by the parties remotely. Each party signed in their own office and took a selfie and sent it out in January 2022. And it was approved by the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Reclamation, on March 1st, 2022. And after the lease was signed, it didn't become effective right away because the Interstate Stream Commission had to file an application with the New Mexico Office of the State Engineer to change the place and purpose of use of the water. That permit application was approved in November of 2022. And at that point, the lease kicked in, and it's in for an initial term of 10 years and can be renewed. Now, as soon as the permit was obtained, the ISC submitted the necessary paperwork to reserve the water from the nation for a release of water in 2023. And in 2023, thanks to a very generous contribution from TNC, we had enough money to reserve the entire 20,000 acre-feet. So the nation reserved the water, and the three parties began to research how best to release the water to help the endangered and threatened fish in the San Juan River. They created a technical team, which included Joe Trangel from TNC, who is somewhere in this audience over there. Hi, Joe. And they interviewed 14 experts in hydrology, geomorphology, and fisheries with direct knowledge of the San Juan River to hear their opinions about how best to use the leased water to help the fish. So 3 options were considered, and I think I'm a little behind. Oops. It's not moving to the next slide. I knew I was going to have problems. No, it's not moving. It's stuck.
Well, that's not helpful at all.
It's not. It should be on slide 14, but I can't get it to move. Let me see if I can do it manually. I apologize about that. I warned everybody I wasn't good about doing this. I don't know why it's not. It should be on that one.
This one?
This one, yes, thank you. So 3 options were considered and ranked: a spring release coinciding with a spring peak in the river, a summer base flow release to augment summer supplies, and a winter release. The experts indicated that the most beneficial course of action for the fish would be a spring release. And coincidentally, as you all know, the hydrology improved so much this winter, the Bureau of Reclamation was able to schedule a spring peak release from Navarro Reservoir to to implement the San Juan River Basin Recovery Implementation Program flow recommendations, which they're almost never able to do. This Spring Peak release from reclamation is ongoing as we speak. The lease water will be included at the tail end of that Spring Peak release. It will augment the flow by about 2 extra days. I can't give you an exact duration because the volumes being released changed daily. And so we're just going to be on the tail end of that. And hopefully that will be in a week or so, maybe more. In addition, the 3 parties are going to install measurement equipment at a number of sites along the San Juan River, which will help us track water elevation and the corresponding flows needed to maintain connectivity of backwaters. We are hopeful that we can learn a lot from this, and this information will help inform our decisions about releases of the leased water in future years. So through this entire negotiation of the lease agreement, and since the implementation began, the 3 parties have worked very, very well together. We continue to meet on a regular basis to discuss coordination of our actions. And we've been able to generate a lot of interest in this project, which has allowed us to obtain funding to finance the next couple of years. From my perspective, this is a success stories, and it's a fast success stories. We started talking about this concept as a group in January of 2020, and here we are in June of 2023, and the water is about to be put in the river. That's pretty fast by the standards of the Colorado River Basin. And by cooperating, these 3 parties have been able to reach an agreement that benefits all of them. The lease provides revenue to the nation, it provides additional water to benefit the fish, and it provides the state of New Mexico with a reserve of water to tap into in case of compact compliance issues. In addition, this process has allowed us to strengthen our relationships with representatives of the nation and the Nature Conservancy. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Daryl Vigil and Celine Hawkins, and also want to talk about Jenny Dumas, the attorney for Hickory, who is on a well-deserved vacation, but has been really central to this process. So we hope the process can be a model for others in the future, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dominique. And I am just as thrilled to welcome Jason Howder up here. He is the counsel for the Gila River Indian community.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. Jason Howder. I represent the Gila River Indian community. A little background on me. After law school, I went home. I'm a member of the Gila River Indian community and was in-house counsel, part of the in-house office, with working under Governor Lewis's father, Rod Lewis, who hired me out of law school. There for about 8 years, and then I ended up joining, getting roped into a big DC law firm. And it really wasn't until then, in 2010, that I started working on water and working on implementation of the Gila River Indian Community's water settlement. I only have 3 slides, and I really want to focus on the lower basin activities and conservation and some of the marketing. I'm most familiar with CAP water marketing in Arizona, and I'll spend some time on that, and then finish with some of the challenges I see it going forward. The topic of this is how can tribes benefit from these undeveloped water rights or continue to benefit from their developed water rights as the basin struggles with the overuse issue that we're all discussing. So jump right into it. There may be some other activities, but in general, on the left you have this kind of conservation activities. On the right you have what I would call marketing activities. It's like the third, on the right-hand column, the third bullet point, until CRIT's recent legislation, really the only marketing activity in Arizona anyway, were through CAP authorized settlements. And in those settlements, tribes, not all, but many had the ability to market their CAP water, not their other water sources, just CAP water. And in many cases, and I'll get into kind of some of the history of that, but that's where most of the marketing activity in Arizona has taken place. The other area involving CAP water is really the creation of long-term storage credits, which are, there's a couple ways you can make that: direct recharge or through deliveries to irrigation districts that are permitted as underground savings facilities. And you can create, you paper water right that can be later recovered, and it's transferable. And in many respects, for tribes, it's a better marketing tool because it doesn't tie up your water entitlements and long-term leases. CRIT's recently had its bill approved by in this last Congress, where for the first time in Arizona, you're going to have a decreed right being marketed in the state. And then I mentioned Quechan's in California, the forbearance agreement. I don't quite understand how it works. I think it's mostly in the marketing side, but maybe there's some conservation to it too. So it maybe could be in either column. And then in the paid system conservation, I think we're in the lower basin, there's a number of tribes that participate in that, have that first started in the pilot program back in, I think it's in the 2015, 2016 era. I know that's when we first did it, was in 2016. And then it became an important tool in the DCP in the lower basin in Arizona. And as we all know, we have under the IRA, the Bucket 1A program. So paid system conservation is the Gila River's participating in that. Tohono O'odham Nation has participated in the past, Fort McDowell. And then and during the DCP, the Colorado River Indian tribes participated quite a bit of system conservation. And then there's also the ability to store water in Lake Mead through the creation of intentionally created surplus. And so that's one area that Gila River has created quite a bit of ICS on the kind of Arizona tribal side of the ledger, approximately 300,000 acre feet of stored water in Lake Mead. A lot of that is through agreements with the United States to have a water supply to firm other water settlements in times of shortage. So we cooperated with the United States to make that our supplies available through stored water in Lake Mead that can then meet needs of future tribes and their settlements. So little background on what's happening. Some key points on CAP water. Actually, want to make one point. I think I'll say the paid system conservation is the one area where I think most of these ICS is a little unique. I think it's kind of it has it's a conservation, so it has a public purpose, and paid system conservation has a public purpose. You're being paid to not use water, and it's benefiting the system. On the marketing side, it's not conservation. Your tribes are benefiting, but it's really, you're providing water usually to a private water source, whether that's a city or developers or otherwise. So some key points on CAP. Of the CAP settlements, as a condition to settlement, many tribes were required to enter into leases. So it wasn't something they were seeking to do. It was a condition to settlement. That was true in Gila River settlement. You look at, and sometimes it's, the access to CAP water, the system, it was going to take some time to do that, or where the location of the tribe is, they just don't have physical access to CAP water. And so that water is then leased to municipalities that are tied into the system. So the marketing to some degree in the CAP was at times forced. And in terms, the terms of those leases weren't necessarily favorable to tribes. And I think that's why some tribes like Gila River like the flexibility of the creation of long-term storage credits. And it's stored probably since 2010, created about 1.7 million acre feet worth of long-term storage credits. So it's been marketed, some of those credits. But one of the questions as we go into, we had this discussion, or heard the earlier panel about the 417 regs, is beneficial use. In times of drought, the creation, this groundwater recharge or creation of long-term storage credits, should that continue to be a beneficial use? And it's something I think the community's, has some opinions about, and I think there's a strong argument that it maybe isn't shouldn't be a beneficial use in certain situations. So, but it's the ability, the community has the ability to do it now. It's actually curtailed its storage activities quite a bit, really to shift its water use for conservation purposes to help Lake Mead. I think the other issue, I think, for CAP tribes, and really it's a couple tribes that have quite a bit of the lower priority non-Indian ag water, or NIA priority, is there's every expectation that that supply is likely not going to be there in the future, or most of that supply will not be there in the future. For the community, that's 120,600 acre feet that's at risk. And even some of its Indian priority CAP water is at risk. So it's looking at real cuts coming down the road and cuts to a substantial cut to its water portfolio that in the end it wants to use on reservation. So some of the challenges, I think why I think that water supply is at risk is because I think eventually implementation of evaporation system loss will happen in the lower basin. If it's equitably done, it'll probably impact all tribes. We fully expect it'll happen, impact Gila River Indian community. And so what do you do about that? And or a more fundamental question, if you kind of look back at the United States responsibility to tribes in terms of meeting the federal trust responsibility, they have a huge problem. And that problem is they can't really meet that trust responsibility by doing what tribes want and not cutting their water. Because the nature of the water rights and the conflicts, the inherent conflicts of those rights in the basin, and particularly in the lower basin, you would put reclamation or the United States in the business of picking winners and losers. And that's probably not a very good outcome and will lead to litigation. What's a more realistic outcome in a way that the United States could help meet its trust responsibility and help tribes is finding replacement water. And kind of long term, if there's going to be cuts, we need to find other sources of water in other water projects. And that's not an easy thing, and that's going to cost a lot of money. But I think that's something I think all tribes are going to start focusing on, and the United States needs to start looking at as a way to meet its trust obligations to tribes. And then finally, I think this benefiting from unused rights without worsening the situation. I think one of the challenges I think tribes have is they're often restricted in how they can use their water rights. They're restricted to on-reservation use, and they can't beneficially use that water off-reservation. And the definition of beneficial use is fairly limited. And I think there's many tribes that probably what they want to do with their water is help the system. And so if they are able to take that unused right, develop it in some conservation way, that might be one way to allow tribes to benefit from their unused water rights, but also not make the situation worse. It's complicated because there's an overuse here. So something like that would probably mean the extinguishment of state appropriated rights in some cases. So I think there's ways to do it. And it will be interesting in the years to come whether we can do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. And I should have mentioned that Jason is one of the other best attorneys I know in the Colorado River Basin. So I want to end with, if we've whetted your appetite on sort of what we mean when we say tribal nations are looking for the development of new flexible tools in the basin, the Water and Tribes Initiative has a policy brief on the Water and Tribes Initiative website that goes into these discussions with a little bit more depth. It also has a more comprehensive list of where flexible water sharing and forbearance agreements have been done or are occurring now in the basin, and some ideas for the future. So I'd invite you all to look at that. And with that, I'm going to sit down and invite Heather Tanana to moderate questions to the panel.
To this panel for staying on time and actually being ahead. So we've got a good solid 25 minutes here for questions. Please continue to put them in. But I thought as an initial matter, and we had a lot of questions for the tribal panel yesterday that I think can relate and we didn't get to. So if we don't get more questions, I'll fill some of those in. But as a preliminary matter, can you give a little bit more background for some of our newer people to the Colorado River Basin and tribal water rights and specifically, and tell us, what do we mean by tribal water rights? How does that relate to federally reserved rights and those limitations that are placed on those water rights in terms of like the Non-Intercourse Act? If you can just give a little bit of a primer on that first, it'll help some of the follow-up.
Okay, I'll take the shot at that. So I think the reserved rights question is something that's interesting. So there's really two cases, if you're interested, for those of you who want to look at it, Supreme Court cases. One is the U.S. versus Winans, it's 1905, I believe, and the other is the United States, and that's 1908. And Winans really established this idea of the reserved rights doctrine, and in that case involved fishing rights and a treaty interpretation in the Pacific Northwest, where there's a provision of the tribes having access to the usual custom places to take fish. And I won't go into we call it the fish wheel case because it involved this fish. I don't want to go into all that, but basically what it stands for, or what the premise of it is, the Supreme Court said a treaty is not a granting of rights to tribes. It is basically a tribe granting rights it already possesses, and if that's not expressly stated in that treaty, what they're granting, everything else that they've already possessed is reserved to them. So the reserved rights doctrine is something to the tribes had all these rights, and they keep the rights they haven't given up. And in that context, it was treaty rights. So conceptually, it's kind of the bundle of sticks analogy in property law. You can give a couple of the sticks, but just whatever the remaining bundle you keep, you still keep those rights. So that's really fundamentally what the kind of the idea of reserved rights are. When you're talking about kind of an Aboriginal right or kind of a Winans type of right, that is really, in the water sense, a time immemorial right. It's always existed, as far as people can remember. So Winters is different in this aspect. It was the establishment of the reservation, Belknap Reservation, in 1888, I believe, before Montana was a state. And it was what the Supreme Court held there is that when the United States established that reservation, it reserved, they had a federal reserved right for enough water, and in that case, irrigation purposes, for the purpose of that reservation, kind of a homeland for the tribes. And so Winters is really a federal reserved right, and the priority of that right, and it's a federal reserve right for the benefit of the tribe, but the priority of that right is the date of the establishment of the reservation. So there's kind of two kind of nuanced views on kind of the reserved rights and the nature of those rights. The Winters rights are basically exempted from state appropriation law. So for instance, where that kind of, a prime example is that in many states in the West, if you do not use your right, it can be forfeited or abandoned. Federal Reserve rights cannot be forfeited. So even if the tribe's not using it, they remain. So that's one distinction. And then what was the other one on the
So not every tribe can lease their.
Oh, yes. So the other is the Trade Non-Intercourse Act. There's basically this provision where that federal trust lands are basically owned by the federal government for the benefit of tribes, and they're restricted on unless they have some authorization through congressional act of leasing that land and using their water reservation or transferring those water rights. And so typically they need a piece of legislation like Crit just got. And also a lot of the settlements contain the ability to use that water in a different way. Usually it's marketing, sometimes it's the ability to use it off reservation. So those are essentially the kind of the general rules.
Awesome. Oops.
And I might add one more thing that might be helpful for us in this conversation. And I think this applies to every quantified tribal water right in the Colorado River Basin, regardless of whether it was done through litigation or settlement, but these are permanent rights held by the United States in trust for the tribal nations. And I'm making that point because when we start talking about durable or permanent solutions, these water rights are held in trust. They can never be sold. They will always be held on behalf of the tribal nations. And so I think that that's relevant in thinking about how much opportunity there is for these water rights to be a big part of the solution moving forward.
And one last thing, which I didn't say in my presentation, but I know it was in my slide, the Hickory Apache Nation water rights settlement allows the tribe to market its water rights off the reservation. And there's not even any restriction that it would have to be in any particular state. So it's a good provision in their settlement. The nation also has some water rights that it has acquired and holds under state law, in addition to its settled water rights.
So somewhat related questions, Lean, you talked about how tribes are at a disadvantage. It's really only consumptive use that we're doing payouts for to conserve water. And so one of our most highly rated questions here is, what needs to happen to change the rule that tribal water rights must be put to consumptive use in order to be eligible for off-reservation marketing? And I'd add compensation to that too.
Is that for me or for the panel?
I might take a shot. So, what tribes need is flexibility to use their water. And Gila River is a prime example of a settlement that provided it a lot of flexibility. So it was able to maximize, it fully uses its CAP entitlements, 311,800 acre feet. Some of that's leased, but it uses it. And so it has this history of using its full entitlement. So it can conserve, can conserve quite a bit of water and participate in the current programs. Many tribes would have to make the decision of if they have a number of unused rights, if they want to do conservation and they don't have that flexibility, they essentially have to fallow land and stop some economic activity on the reservation and make that water available for conservation. And so really to address that, they need more flexible tools to be able to use their water rather than this kind of perverse, your tribe could create a white elephant project on reservation, use all of its water rights, and then participate in conservation. But it seems silly and inane to do that. But under the current law, that's what they'd have to do if they wanted to participate in conservation. So it seems like one policy change was the more flexibility for tribes to beneficially use their water in a way that is a benefit to the system, not necessarily, and so, the marketing component, I think, is important, but also where the policy of using unused water rights for the benefit of tribes, I think you can get more traction, I think, politically, if that is going towards some conservation effort that benefits as a public good.
I think it's the $1 million question. We've got to be creative. Flexibility is definitely something we need, but we also need to continue to come up with new ideas about how to do that as a community.
And I'll focus a little bit on the water conservation programs that we've developed so far in the upper and lower basin. None of the existing water conservation programs allow for payment for anything that's not conserved consumptive use at this point. And so when we think about tribal participation in those programs, what that means is that there's also no state or federal revenue source that is funding programs like this. So I see it as both a program design and how we expend our public funds into the basin being a question here. And I think we're going to have programs that are flexible enough in their sideboards to allow better tribal participation. And we're going to need to make sure that we have public funding to back those programs, because without money, the programs don't do a whole lot for the tribes.
And I have a couple questions kind of going along this line of water rights and settlements. What key lessons do you think we've learned from prior tribal water rights settlements in the basins that, you know, there's still outstanding water rights, they're being negotiated, adjudicated right now. Some key lessons you think we've learned so far. And then another question was, what do tribes have, how, if at all, could the off-reservation marketing provision in settlements be improved?
So I think one key lesson we've learned is when you know one tribal settlement, you know one tribal settlement, because they're all different. And depending on when they occurred and who the tribe is and who the administration is, they focus on different things in different ways sometimes. So it's very difficult to find a thread, you know, like, I think we are more in a place right now where the federal government is willing to give a lot of money to tribes to settle and not so much water. And I think that might be very different from the situation in the early 80s, or in the 80s and the early 90s, when some other settlements were enacted. And so I don't see a uniformity over time. And I think, unfortunately, that means that each tribe has to deal with the settlement that it has, if it has one. And going forward, I also don't know that we can have uniformity, because, to quote Daryl, when you know one tribe, you know one tribe. And each situation is kind of unique. But I would say time is of the essence for tribes, if possible, to get settlements, because at least in the Colorado River Basin, that supply is finite, and the people who don't have quantified rights at the end of the day will lose.
I mean, do you think though, right, I've heard Celine really emphasize the human right aspect to this challenge, that we don't have tribal water infrastructure. And we know that settlements, as opposed to adjudicating tribal water rights, is one of those ways that you can get infrastructure projects included. And in the past, some tribes, to get those much needed infrastructure projects, they've agreed to more junior priority dates. Do you think there's still that pressure today, or that this growing recognition of the human right aspect has made it easier for tribes to hold on to some very senior priority dates?
So I just want to talk about one example, although Crystal Tully-Cordova would be probably a better person to talk about this. In New Mexico, as part of the settlement with the Navajo Nation, we have the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project. This is a project that is going to bring clean drinking water to 43 Navajo chapters on the reservation. The settlement dates back from 2007. The Act of Congress is 2009. We've been trying to build that project since then. This is now a $2 billion project that is maybe halfway done. And we are behind schedule, and we are over budget, and we are going back to Congress to ask them for more money. And hopefully it's the last time, but we can't be sure about that. So there are pitfalls to those big infrastructure projects, because you can agree to a lot of things in a settlement, and then reality kicks in.
To your point of junior priority, I think the Arizona settlements, the 2004 Arizona Water Settlements Act, set aside this non-Indian ag, this NIA priority water to address some future settlements. And now that it's a lower priority, it's at risk. It can still be used, most recently was used in the context of White Mountain Apache, well, I guess Hualapai as well. But in that context, that water was immediately leased to municipalities, and then it's firmed. The United States has an obligation to firm that, find replacement supplies when it's not available. But it is a supply that was set aside, but is at risk of even being there. And so it creates some additional costs and risks for the United States if they're going to use that as a way to reach settlement of some of the unresolved claims. Now, most of the unresolved claims, other than I think Navajo and Hopi that may be accessing this, or the other tribes that tend to be fairly small, but it is a challenge, and it's a water supply I think you can't really rely on and being physically available. In terms of human rights, I think it's, what do we mean by that? If you're talking about just access to clean drinking water, that's not so much a large volume of water necessarily for most communities. That's just the cost of a project. And so in many respects, should be an easier problem to solve because we have more money than we have water in this space. And I think now doesn't mean there's not political challenges of getting that money, but that's one thing that is more readily available. If you mean that a tribe, you kind of needs the ability to grow economies beyond just the basics, then that's a larger volume of water, and that's a much bigger challenge.
And I just have a couple of things to add. One is that thanks to the work that you, Heather, and Bitte Becker and Ann Castle have done, I think that the basin-wide conversation around universal access to clean water has changed in the last few years. And so I think we might be at a point in the basin that conversation happens outside of settlement negotiations now. I don't think that was the case even maybe 5 years ago. So I do think we've seen movement there, and I think that everybody, including the principals for the 7 basin states, have been on record saying that this is a matter that we need to solve as we move forward in the basin. The other thing, which was more related to how settlements are looking different, is we are now seeing settlements in the basin that have explicit provisions on what happens in the event of compact curtailment. I'm thinking specifically of the Navajo-Utah settlement that is still under the approval process. That's a big difference. Many of the settlements from the sort of 1980s and 90s do not have explicit provisions around curtailment, and so there's more potential for conflict and litigation if and when curtailment occurs, and we're looking at what happens under those settlements.
So going back to Dominique, there's a few questions specific to the Jicarilla settlement. One was, how much per acre foot is Jicarilla being compensated? They're also curious if any of the reclamation funding had been used to support that, specifically the IRA, $4 billion. And then finally, can Jicarilla water continue to be used for other downstream uses, such as the restoration of the Delta in Mexico?
So on the price per acre foot, the range is from $190 per acre foot to $88 per acre foot. And again, it's a sliding scale. This scale was based on some market studies that were done in New Mexico a couple of years ago. I suspect with things that have happened since, if we did those studies today, the prices would be higher, which would be good. As far as the money, the only entities that are paying for this are the Nature Conservancy and the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. No other money is used for that. This is completely separate from System Conservation Pilot Program, and it was a concept before we even considered doing System Conservation Pilot Program again. And what was the third question?
Let's say if the water would be able to be used to continue down into the Delta, like the use of the water.
So the way this works and the way the Strategic Water Reserve works, we can control what we're doing with this water all the way to the state line. And then after that, presumably it's going down to Lake Powell. And then after that, we have no control over what happens.
All right, I think we've got time for a couple more. What do tribes have to do if they want to devote part of their water rights to in-stream flows for cultural, spiritual, or economic, recreational reasons?
I think there needs to be a policy change that allows for that. I think I mean, to some degree, if you are, I mean, I think there's I think some tribes have the ability to do that or through development on reservation, riparian habitat and that kind of thing. But if they're really trying to benefit the system kind of upstream or something, or a certain cultural site that's away from the reservation, I think it's a bigger challenge and they really need more flexibility to do that. So they have some ability, but it's somewhat limited unless there's a policy change.
And I would add on to that, because I can't help myself, that if a tribal nation goes to court and gets the quantification number for their water rights, as the 5 main stem tribal nations have done, there's no limit on how that water can be used. There is a difference of opinion, particularly in the state of Wyoming, about whether in-stream flow is a use that can be made. But just, you know, the starting line is that the quantification is a number, and how that water is used is up to the tribal nations. I think the reality is, particularly when you get into the settlements that are negotiated, there are often additional negotiated terms that cover how that water can be used. And so I think, at least in the upper basin where I have more familiarity, this becomes a question of the terms of the settlement negotiation, whether that use is allowed or whether there needs to be sort of creative thinking, like tribal water rights enrolled into state tools, which we're testing out in New Mexico. So there are often tools within a state, and the question is it possible, given sovereignty and all the other concerns for tribal water, to use those programs, or do we need separate programs for tribal water?
Awesome. And then to end the panel, there's a question talking about partners and support, and it was specific to reclamation, but I want to expand it out because TNC seemed to play a very big role in the Hickory Agreement that was accomplished. And so maybe Celine, if you can talk about this NGO world, and our next panel is about environmental interests, but what role can they be playing and are playing to facilitate settlements and advancing tribal water rights? Maybe Dominique talk about that state role, and Jason, if you don't mind, reclamation. What are they doing? What can they be doing better? But this idea that when we have partners, we seem to accomplish more and go further. So whoever wants to start, and we'll end on that.
Yeah, we've had Gila River a strong partnership with reclamation. I will say, you know, I love our federal partners, but you kind of have to have the patience and grind through the process to make it work. And not all tribes have the resources to do that. I think it's a big challenge for many of them for the federal projects. That being said, I think there's an opportunity in the Bucket 2 IRA funds. If tribes are willing to, for example, canal lining, there's a lot of outdated BIA-run irrigation systems. If they're made more efficient and tribes are willing to make those savings as, you know, as a contribution for a long-term contribution, or conservation, whatever that is, whatever the term is, that they can work out the United States, that might be a way for tribes to address some of the infrastructure needs on reservation. So I think there's opportunities given the current funding available, but I won't say it's an easy process, but you can do it.
Well, I think the Hickory lease is all about partnership, and TNC has been very, very instrumental in getting us to where we are today, mostly because they paid the lion's share of the water for this year, but also because they made sure that we were together, we were able to continue to meet through COVID. They have a Zoom account, which we've put many miles on. But they've really, and even now, Celine is keeping us on task and, let's meet, let's talk about what are we doing next. They've played a crucial role, and we would not have done this quickly without them. There's no question about that.
I think what Dominique is trying to politely say is that I spent 4 years in law school and graduate school, but most of what I do is Outlook calendaring in my career. I'll just end on, I really think about the work that we do as, building movement and not transactional. And so I think about the relationships that we're setting, not from the stance of, this is a really incredible project, but more, for me, this started with coffee with Daryl and Jenny exploring what we might do together. And I am really hopeful that this is not the thing that we're doing together, but the first of many things that we're doing together. And what I want to end with is that it's been really important for me in the design of our project budget to think about the capacity needs of all of our partners, state and tribal. And we made a point early on to offer to cover any of the diligence costs that needed to be undertaken for the deal, but also to consistently integrate capacity payments for the tribal nation in to make sure that their staff and consultants had time and space to dedicate to this project, knowing that they work on nearly everything else in the Upper Basin right now. So I think that's a way that conservation groups can show up, not only to figure out what gaps our staff can fill, but to make sure that there's some parity in fundraising so that the partners can truly co-create the work. And I think that's why this agreement has been so successful, is that we have all been able to make the time to make it happen.
All right, thank you all. Don't get out of your seats, folks, unless you are part of the next panel, because we're going to start right then with the next group. This is a panel about the protecting environmental interests. And it is, again, it's a huge topic, and we gave it an hour, so that's on me. That's what we're going to do. All right, we got 3 folks. I always worry when the panelists aren't down here when I start that I'm just going to be standing here and no one's going to show up. But all right, our panelist did show up. I'm just going to go in the order listed here, unless you guys have come to a different arrangement, which means that we will. You want to go last? Well, of course you do. Okay. We will start with Eric Balkin, who's the Executive Director of the Glen Canyon Institute. Eric, I'm assuming that you brought pretty pictures for us?
I did indeed.
Well, I don't see them. Let me see where, I didn't set this up, so I don't know where anything is. Oh, Friday. Thank God it's Friday, Eric. And, all right. Is that not right? Oh, that's right.
I think we're there. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Balkin with Glen Canyon Institute. First, I want to say thanks to Doug and everyone putting this on. Really appreciate this opportunity to be here today. I'm going to be discussing emerging resources in Glen Canyon that used to be submerged under Lake Powell and that have come out since the drawdown of the reservoir over the past 20 or so years. Just to orient ourselves a little bit in thinking about Glen Canyon as the place and not just the storage facility, I wanted to give a little geographic context. Glen Canyon, of course, is a significant place to 19 tribes and bands. And when Glen Canyon Dam was built, there were indigenous people living in the canyon. It's a place that is surrounded by national parks and monuments. To the south, of course, is Grand Canyon National Park. To the west is Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. To the north is Canyonlands National Park, and to the east is Bears Ears National Monument. So as the reservoir has come down over the past couple decades, a lot of the emerging areas resemble a lot of the characteristics that we see in those surrounding parks and monuments. So we're seeing a lot of geologic wonders emerge, lots of sediment that is mobilizing with flash floods. There's a lot of ecological succession taking place, returning rivers and streams, new recreational opportunities, and the emergence of cultural resources. So, of course, I have to talk about the geologic wonders that have come out in Glen Canyon. This is getting a lot of coverage in the news because it's just really fascinating to witness. This is Gregory Natural Bridge. When it was first documented, Gregory, I think who it was named after, said it was one of the largest bridges in the country. I don't know that that's true, but it is a very, one of the largest for sure. It first went underwater in May of 1969, and it came out of water in, I think, August of 2021. So you can see some of these elevation lines on here that in March of 1990, at 3652, that's where the reservoir was. So when the reservoir was full, you could actually boat over the bridge. For the past year or so, at elevation, hovering around 3520, there's a huge amount of the span that's been exposed. Cathedral in the Desert, of course, another crown jewel of Glen Canyon, written about quite a bit in the pre-dam days and the post-dam days. Just some elevation markers of where the top of the waterfall is, where the bottom of the floor is when it first came out, and an attempted photo match here with an old Philip Hyde photo. Cathedral in the Desert is actually a really good example of how sediment mobilizes in some of these side canyons. The photo on the left is from May of 2021. And you can see that as the reservoir dropped down, what was left behind is a huge amount of sediment in the chamber. And you see this in basically all of the tributary canyons in Glen. And in May of 2023, you can see that a huge amount of that sediment was flushed out through flash flood cycles. That you can't see it well in this photo, but back by the waterfall, there's about 30 feet vertical sediment that had been moved out through some big flash flood cycles. So it's impressive to see that amount of change in that short amount of time. And so in addition to this moving sediment, we're seeing a lot of ecological change in Glen Canyon that's been really fascinating to observe. And just a note on the scale of what's happening in Glen Canyon, at the spring low levels, so around elevation 3520, there are over 100,000 acres of land that are out that used to be submerged under Lake Powell. And when you count the tributary rivers of the Colorado, the San Juan, the Escalante, the Dirty Devil, the 125 plus side canyons that all feed into Glen Canyon, it's hundreds of linear miles of riparian corridor that are now flowing once again. And the speed of ecological succession is very rapid in Glen Canyon because all the recipes are there for it, or all the makings of it. And what that really means is flowing water. What's unique about Glen Canyon, as opposed to other parts of the Colorado River, is that a lot of the tributary streams have perennially flowing water in them. And so that's what made Glen such a luscious, special place before, and a verdant area. And it's what's making this restoration happen really quickly now. So this is a fun little photo match I did of a willow tree in Davis Gulch. And you can see that in May of 2021, the tree was about 5 feet high. And by September of 22, it's almost 20 feet high. And you can see the surrounding foliage too, and how quickly that has come up. And so this is a really big question about, what's going on with this ecosystem and this vegetation. And so we're really excited to partner on this new survey that's happening in Glen Canyon. The lead researcher is Seth Ahrens from Western Water Assessment, and he's looking at what is the composition of vegetation in these areas that were previously inundated. How are these areas different from sites that were never inundated above the high water mark? And how are these ecosystems changing over time? This is just a quick map of the survey sites that have been done so far. It's a 4-year study with the aim of revisiting these sites over time. And just the mechanics of this study are that, he's doing transects perpendicular to the tributary streams using quadrats and getting vascular plant cover data to give us a really big overall picture of what's coming back as far as vegetation and how is it changing over time. So to really understand what this is like on the ground, several of you in here I have had the privilege of going to Glen Canyon with. We've had a lot of great trips down there. And for those of you who haven't, I want to do a little virtual tour up a side canyon. So pretend for a moment that we boated across the reservoir. This is Moki Canyon. It's just upstream from Bullfrog. We hop out of the boat, and what do we see? The first thing you see in areas that have been uncovered for a short amount of time, so this is just a week, it's a pretty barren landscape. There's really not a lot of vegetation around. But as you start to go further up canyon to higher elevation, this photo on the right has been out of water for a year and a half. You start to see more grasses and shrubs start to take hold. In this photo, actually, most of that vegetation is native. And then as you get further up into areas that have been out of water for 2 or 3 years, you start to see situations like this where you have a little more robust matured stands of coyote willow. You see some bigger cottonwood trees up on the stream bank. And as you get further up, that trend kind of continues. You see even more pronounced cottonwoods and willows along the stream banks and even bigger cottonwood trees up on the side there. Up at elevation 3645, this has been out of water for 11 years, and you start to see evidence of wildlife like beaver dams. There's lots of beaver activity in these side canyons. And I think it's a good reminder that what we're seeing come back is wildlife habitat. We see a lot of beaver, mule deer, bighorn, bobcat, birds, bugs, bees, frogs, lizards, snakes. These canyons are really teeming with life. That were once underwater. And I think it's a really incredible thing to witness. And up here towards the end of this area has been out of water for 23 years. If you're really not looking for it, it's almost hard to tell that it was ever inundated. And so just a quick, snapshot of what the study has found so far. The 2022 sites, if you look at the differences between sites that were never inundated and sites that were, above the high water mark, you generally see more plant cover. You see more cover of cactus and crust and trees. Below 3,700, you see more forbs and grasses, which are kind of the early colonizers, which is what you would expect, more bare ground. And then just looking at the difference of native versus non-native plant life in these areas, there's actually not that big of a difference in overall trend between the two, which is pretty surprising. So what I would say about this is that, when canyons are first exposed, they do tend to be dominated by invasive species like Russian thistle or other grasses. But over time, they trend towards more native cover, primarily coyote willow, baccharis, seep willow, cottonwood trees, plants like that. You do see these invasive species there, but overall, it's a pretty impressive amount of native coverage. So rapid colonization of plants in a pretty short amount of time. Given time, there's abundant native growth. The species assemblages vary really drastically from canyon to canyon. It's hard to generalize this restoration process overall, but there's a really big variety of what you see. And we're also seeing the reemergence of hanging gardens, which is very special. And this is just a photo of a hiker at the top of Lake Canyon. So that was about 30 feet below full pool, and you can see the size of that cottonwood tree, really, really big cottonwood trees coming out in those upper reaches. We're also seeing the return of the tributary rivers into Glen Canyon. The San Juan River here is at the spring low stand of the reservoir. There's about 45 miles of a newly flowing river. This is the mouth of Nokai Canyon up here on the left. Really kind of dramatic viewpoint up there to see from that elevation. And this is a photo of a boater floating past a really robust grove of cottonwood trees. And this is probably not what most people think about when you think about a low stand Lake Powell. You don't think about these returning rivers and this really robust, it's almost a forest of cottonwood trees. And when we saw that at that elevation that used to be almost 100 feet under Lake Powell, it was really surprising and I think inspiring to see that quickness of ecological return. I want to give a shout out to a group called the Returning Rapids Project, who we work very closely with. They are looking at the returning rapids of Cataract Canyon on the main stem Colorado River. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cataract Canyon, it is just upstream from Glen. It is below the confluence of the Green and the Colorado, and a good chunk of it was inundated when Lake Powell was full. So what they're looking at is how many rapids were there actually in Cataract Canyon? How fast is the river carving through the sediment that was left behind? And which rapid will emerge next? And so this super high-tech rendering of Lake Powell at full pool just gives you a sense of what this area looked like when the reservoir was full and what it looks like now. So you can see really dramatic, stark difference. The sediment that was left behind has been flushed away in this location. This is, I believe, the Chute Rapid. You can see the kind of dwindling stands of the tamarisk up there, and most of this area, I don't know if they're dead or dying, but they're certainly not thriving tamarisk. So pretty dramatic change there. On the Colorado River main stem, again, spring low point, 44 new river miles, 7 major new rapids, lots of moving sediment, really a lot of questions about sediment. You could do a whole conference just about the sediment, but pretty incredible to see. I would encourage you to visit the Returning Rapids website, check out their field binders. They put out a lot of really good detailed information about the changes on the main stem. And so these new rivers and side canyons are offering recreational resources, river recreation, backcountry human-powered recreation. I describe this as a sort of transition from reservoir recreation economy to a national park style economy that resembles some of those surrounding parks and monuments. And of course, there are emerging cultural resources in Glen Canyon as well. Glen Canyon was inhabited by human beings for over 10,000 years. We all know that there were thousands of archaeological sites in the canyon. Many of them have come out of water. Some of them are still relatively intact. There are rock art panels, there are structures, there are burial sites. And I think it necessitates a lot of care in thinking about the future of this canyon and how those cultural sites are managed. And then finally, I would just add that streams and trees are cultural sites too. In a lot of our conversations with Indigenous folks, they've reminded us that, the cottonwood trees and the seeps, all of those have cultural significance as well. So I want to say thanks to all the collaborators that are making this work possible. If you're able to get the QR code, I'd encourage you to check those out for a little follow-up. And I would just kind of close by saying too, while there's a lot of variables taken into consideration about where we store water, how we manage water, there's a lot coming back in Glen Canyon and it has value. And when we choose to store water in Glen Canyon, there's a cost. And it's just one of many variables that I think needs to be taken into consideration in managing this river. So thanks a lot.
All right, thank you. So what do you think, a whole conference on sediment? Yes, just sediment and you. Yeah, okay, that'll be great. All right, Garrett, you heard that Jennifer wants to go last, so that means you're up next. I haven't met you. I don't even know how to say your last name. Vogesser?
Good enough.
Close, is it? Okay. Well, that's as good as I can do. He's a senior director of tribal partnerships and policy for the National Wildlife Federation. And I have no idea what you're going to talk about, which will mean it'll be a very educational moment for myself, and I'm sure the rest of you. So, do you have slides or anything?
No, I didn't.
Oh.
Well, actually, that's a good segue because when Matthew McKinney asked me to talk, I said, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, whatever you want. And I said, great. And so that's what I'm going to do. Thanks for allowing me to be here and speak today. I wanted to say that I'm very blessed to have spent almost 20 years now working on Colorado River issues and partnering with tribes and working with different folks and sitting down and having conversations. And part of what I wanted to say is that I want to reflect that some of the things I'm going to share today are based on those conversations in rooms like this, but over meals and in other places. And also, I really appreciate, Celine, the comment you made, I don't know where you are now, but about free, prior, and informed consent, and that being really an anchor of self-determination. At a recent meeting, speaking to our shared future and relationship with the natural world, a gentleman named Orville Lind, who's a Lutic, Sugpiaq native and native liaison with the Fish and Wildlife Service, said, "How far we choose to see is how far we'll go." So I'm going to share some thoughts about centering tribal, ecological, and cultural values in Colorado River management and moving from vision and values to action and implementation. And then wrap up with a few thoughts about the investment needed in youth and emerging tribal leaders. Actually, at the same conference up in Alaska, Native American Fish and Wildlife Conference, this spring, Mary Peltola, Yupik Alaska Native and U.S. Representative for Alaska, said this: traditional knowledges are the only way to create a complete picture of the places we call home. I believe we have an obligation and a moral responsibility to ensure that tribal ecological and cultural values help shape Colorado River management. And I'm really glad that one of the last questions in this session brought up this issue. So by that, I mean we have an obligation and a responsibility to support and partner with tribes to co-create and implement strategies that translate values into water management policy and practice. Translating values, those can be triggering words, they can be tricky. Let's not be trapped by words or language. Let's focus on intent and intention. By focusing on intention, we're focusing on what really matters. Approaching the issues we're facing with the Colorado River brings many challenges, but also many opportunities. Challenges, obligations, responsibilities, and opportunities. There are opportunities to see, to understand, and act in new ways. Opportunities to shift our ways of thinking. Some of these obligations or opportunities that I believe we should collectively focus on include increasing the dialogue and agreement among tribal, state, and federal sovereigns, with one result being the prioritization of tribal ecological and cultural values. The sovereigns have obligations to each other and to all of us who have an interest in the stake in the river. Next, tribal traditional knowledges should be elevated alongside Western science in Colorado River management and policy. Tribal traditional values should be uplifted as central principles in tribal gatherings and community conversations, hopefully resulting in policy priorities that are based around ecological and cultural values. Next, we can and should be allies and support enhanced communication between tribal governments and their communities that expand the knowledge and awareness of river issues and water management to all sectors of tribal communities, whether it be government, staff, elders, members, and youth. And yesterday, as Nora mentioned, we have an obligation to think of all people and involve them. Next, collectively, we must participate and partner with others. It is in the interest of everyone to connect and interconnect: the NGOs, water experts and managers, farmers, ranchers, and the sovereigns. Think of how far we've come and opportunities to gather, to talk, and to listen. It's astounding to me where we've come from to not having a tribal issue or subject on an agenda at a Colorado River meeting to where we're at with this meeting today. There's so many opportunities: the Water and Tribes Initiative, the Upper Basin Tribal NGO Coalition, the Lower Basin Tribal Coalition, the Colorado River Campaign, the Basin State Dialogues, the BOR Tribal Information Exchange, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all opportunities to sustain and elevate tribal ecological and cultural values. And we also have the trust responsibility, which is an opportunity to elevate tribal traditional values and other water priorities. We have an obligation to ensure a process with robust, meaningful tribal consultation. We have an obligation to ensure there's dialogue between the sovereigns, the feds, the states, and the tribes that surfaces and instills the importance of ecological and cultural values in the framework for the post-2026 guidelines. The Bureau of Reclamation needs to implement a process alongside consultation to provide capacity support, technical assistance, and data for the tribes to examine and shape management protocols. Perhaps this is the Tribal Information Exchange that Daryl mentioned yesterday. Perhaps it's another process alongside that. For those of us that work for NGOs or in academic institutions and other non-governmental stakeholders, we also have an obligation and an opportunity to support tribal needs for technical assistance and collaborative support for influencing management prescriptions. whether that's data such as water flow models and impacts to cultural and ecological resources and water rights, or some other issue. This was brought up in the last panel, that we all have an opportunity to fill those gaps, those capacity gaps that are so apparent to all of us. Next, the guidelines must thoroughly examine and assess management implications for cultural and ecological resources. These need to be robust and thorough examinations that involve conversations and dialogue with all of the interested folks involved. And as I've hit home, and I'm going to say it again, the guidelines must thoroughly examine and assess management implications for cultural and ecological values. The traditional tribal values are part of the knowledge framework that we must base our decisions and our conversation on, alongside Western science. We can all be advocates for the tribal, ecological, and cultural values in the guidelines management alternatives. So that's a lot of obligations, a lot of responsibilities, but I believe we're up for it, and we have to be. So I want to turn for a minute to talk about emerging leaders. An investment is needed in young and emerging tribal leaders, as important in and of itself, but also because I believe a youth movement on tribal values shaping river policy is needed to bring new perspective to our conversations and new power to this process. Speaking of free, prior, and informed consent, I asked Nora about using a little of her quote that we've used before in some of the gatherings that we've done over the years through a group called the Colorado River Tribal Vision Group, which brings together different folks from different aspects of tribal communities, whether it's elders or young people or natural and cultural resource staff and other community members. And she had said that to teach our children, grandchildren, and their kids, so when their time comes and they step into the shoes of being the next elders, moving forward, they have a responsibility. So to me, to Nora, the river means all of who we are, all of our existence, and why it's important for us to continue to teach the things we were told. I've heard at this gathering and many others, agreement that we're looking out for future generations, that we need to encourage, support, and guide young people. Young people need to be in these rooms with us, and we need to support them in creating their own spaces. We need to support stronger connections between young people and elders, and to tribal natural resource and cultural resource experts, and to all of us. One way I believe we can help fulfill this responsibility is to support the formation of an intertribal Colorado River Youth Council, broadly representative of the basin's 30 tribes, that positions young people and emerging tribal leaders to participate in and advocate on water issues. We can also support the mobilization of such a youth council to center tribal ecological and cultural values, and equally important, to bring forward their own ideas and freshen this process. A number of years ago, a group of us were discussing what it meant to translate cultural and ecological values into action. Ann Castle shared an article called Voices of Understanding. To this day, that article remains in my inbox. And it's an examination of Western and Indigenous models of decision-making. The piece focused on the concept of ethical space and decision-making models, and how the traditional cultures and Western cultures can create connections to develop management processes that respect both cultures. In that document, Dr. Reg Crowshoe, Pikiani Nation, said, "My hope for this is that oral traditions and Western world concepts can work together to open ethical spaces that will help us teach youth and help us reach decisions." So I want to harken back to the quote I used at the beginning and from Orville Lind. How far we choose to see is how far we will go. Centering tribal, ecological, and cultural values and investing in young leaders is one important step in how far we choose to see and where we will go in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. I hope you all are sending questions in as we go. We should have some time for questions. All right, up next, Jennifer Pitt. As you've probably noticed by now, I'm not very good at introductions. And so I must confess, the last time Jennifer was speaking at an event, I introduced her as the most beloved member of the Colorado River community. And I looked over after I said that to see that she was giving me a rather nasty look. And I thought to myself, what an odd reaction from the most beloved member of the Colorado River community. So I'm not going to say that this time. She's the Colorado River Program Director at National Audubon Society, and that's all I'm going to say, Jennifer. Do you have slides or anything?
No. Thanks, Doug, and thank you, Gutsch's Wilkinson Center, for having me back. I think I spoke here last year, and I've spoken here quite a few years. And for those of you who know me, I have spent a lot of my 25-year career on the Colorado River working on U.S.-Mexico border issues and working with a coalition of NGOs in the U.S. and mostly in Mexico to restore habitat in the Colorado River Delta. And I want to take you back to those early days in the late 90s for just a second and say, you know, the Delta had really been left for dead. That was a 2 million acre ecosystem, the largest desert estuary in North America, and it got dried out. And I'm not going to talk about why or whose fault that was. It just pretty much happened. And I spent many years working with colleagues figuring out a way to get the two countries cooperating to do something about it. And the good news is we did. And I think sometimes about, you know, how do we do that? Because I think a lot of people thought that was something that never would get addressed and was impossible. And I think partly what happened was we started putting a spotlight on the conditions there. And the two countries basically peered into the abyss of that destruction and realized it was a really bad look. And that actually, if we could start working together to do something about it, even if it was something small, and it is small, that might be a better course forward. And I bring that up. I'm not going to talk today all about the Colorado River Delta, but I bring that up because I feel like we're at a moment right now. I mean, I was here for Brad's talk yesterday, and he's talking about what's going to happen to flows, and that's terrifying on its own. But think about what's happening to the watershed, what's happening to the landscape in the Colorado River Basin beyond. Think about what's happening in Canada today. Someone told me recently that they thought that in 10 to 15 years, every college graduate their job is going to be some kind of climate change job, somehow related. This is so pervasive in our society, in our, disrupting our systems, that we are all going to have to focus on it, certainly in the future. And I'm bringing this up because I want us to think about the opportunities we have right now to ease some of that transition. I can't promise it eases it for 100 years, but I think as we're looking forward, there are things that we could do and that we should do to help every person and every living thing that depends on this basin, and in particular in the water of this basin, because water is life, we all depend on it, to help us survive and thrive into the future. And I do think at this moment, as we're sort of marching towards 2026 with a thought about some big changes possible, needed on system operations, that maybe we need to broaden our thinking a little bit, and that in broadening our thinking to think both about flows and plumbing and also about investments in the broader watershed, that we actually create more opportunity and a better future, and actually an easier path towards making the changes that we need to make to stabilize the water supply, about which we heard so much yesterday. So I want to talk for just a few minutes about what those investments might be, and a little bit about where we need help on flows. So the forests, you saw Pat's picture, and we have a problem with forest health. It's warming, it's beetle, which is related to warming, it's fire management, it's all of that. It all also has consequence for our water supplies. I don't need to explain that here, but I think smart investments in watershed health and forest management are needed right now. We also have an opportunity to invest in wetlands restoration. We've taken to calling that investments in natural distributed storage. As snowpack diminishes in the mountains, we're losing natural storage in the basin. We can invest to restore wetlands in the valley bottoms, recharge aquifers, create wildlife habitat, slow the water down as it's moving through the system, and basically get back some of that natural distributed storage. As ag comes out of production on a temporary or permanent basis, I'm not here to say what it should be or how that should work. I do think we need to pay attention to what we're leaving behind on a temporary or permanent basis in terms of those fields that both will become sources of emissive dust and also today with crops on them are serving as surrogate habitat for wildlife that has lost a lot of habitat that once was created by the river. So can we create incentives and invest in cover crops for those fields and avoid making a dust bowl problem for ourselves? I think we've also heard discussion about investment needed in urban reuse systems, and that's a place where the cities have lots of people and can pay, but I think we can accelerate those investments with federal dollars as well. And we also know that there are plenty of places in the basin where there is opportunity to invest in agricultural infrastructure, in the irrigation systems, in on-farm ways that will allow farmers to continue to produce, ranchers to continue to operate, but with systems that allow them to do so with less water. So all of those investments, ways to extend our water supply and prevent some of the pernicious outcomes of climate change. And a lot of that is summarized in a report that Audubon worked with other conservation groups to put together a couple of years ago called 10 Strategies for Resilience in the Colorado River Basin. If you haven't already seen it, I recommend it. Another place where we need to see continued investment are the recovery programs in the Upper Basin, the San Juan, in the Lower Colorado River Basin, multi-species conservation program. I was dismayed to see discussion in the draft SEIS that we've set aside for the moment, that those habitats are expected to be experiencing water shortages as more shortages are implemented in the Lower Basin. I'm of the mindset that the environment is the source of all the other water that we have put to use all over the landscape. And if we have chosen to invest already in these little bits of remaining habitat along the Lower Basin, the main stem river in the Lower Basin, that perhaps that's not where we should be creating our system reliability from shorting those habitats of water. So those are all habitat programs where we are now investing in trying to make sure that endangered species and other species still have some place to hang on in this basin. And I think we can do more than simply attend to the endangered species obligations there. And I am really pleased to see tribal leaders talking about investments in restoration Currently beginning to work with the Cocopah tribe on a restoration project they want to implement on their Cocopah West Reservation in the Limitrof Reach to put habitat back and to restore their supply of natural resources that they need for their culture, to perpetuate their traditions. And so I do think there's great opportunity to go beyond those endangered species programs. And we have a big federal investment at the moment in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And it would be great to see those federal funds being directed towards this entire suite of investments that I've just run through. I think we need to focus those investments. We don't yet know how they're all going to be spent. And I think that as we start looking past 2026, we're going to see that we might want more investment of that sort to make sure that this place, the Colorado River Basin, is a place that we still can all survive and thrive. I also want to talk about flows. I loved that, I'm just having a senior moment from Utah yesterday. Who's the state representative from Utah? Jean. Sorry. Yes, you're right there. Sorry, senior moment. Mentioned that, actually, not anymore. But Jean mentioned that, I listened carefully to the answers that the states gave to the question about what can we do about environment that we see declining before our eyes right now. And I thought the best answer was the one that, with these managed releases to stabilize our system water supplies, we also have an opportunity to optimize flows for the wildlife that depend on them. And I think there's an opportunity if the Upper Basin chooses to go the route of some kind of program for conserved consumptive use in the future, still up for debate. But if that happens, to manage those flows that are being created for system reliability, manage them in a way that gives our wildlife a better shot at hanging on. There are also ecosystems that are dependent on flows that run off of irrigated agriculture, and I'm thinking of two in particular in the lower basin. One is the Salton Sea, sitting downstream from water users in the Imperial and Coachella valleys. The other is the Cienega de Santa Clara. It's the largest remaining wetland in the Colorado River Delta, fed almost exclusively by runoff from the Welton Mohawk Irrigation and Drainage District in southern Arizona. And we used to have lots of discussion about something called the human desalting plant. And I haven't had those discussions for a few years. And that's nice to be able to devote my attention to other things. But it certainly has occurred to me that when we start to get more clarity on how the Lower Basin Plan is going to actually be implemented on the ground, what are we going to do if we see that there are contracts at Welton Mohawk? We know at the Salton Sea, there's a program in place to do some mitigation as Imperial has made those commitments to some fallowing or some water conservation, I should say. But what are we going to do if Welton Mohawk has also signed up? We don't have an answer yet, and gets even more complicated with another sovereign, the Republic of Mexico, involved. So I do think that as we head towards 2026 and we're thinking about how are we going to retool our system to create reliable water supplies, we need to be thinking about all of this as well. And finally, we have, through the US-Mexico collaborative process that I have worked on for many, many years, although we've only had the agreements in place since 2012, we have a program that has enabled the non-governmental organizations working in partnership with both Mexican and US federal agencies to put between 1,500 and 2,000 acres of native habitat back onto the riparian corridor of the Colorado River in the Delta. And those are all irrigated habitats, and much like the MSCP habitats. And for 3 years since we've had these agreements in place, 2014, 2021, and 2022, we've had in-channel flows. We've had a flowing river in the Colorado River Delta. 2014 got all the press as the big pulse flow, but in 21 and 22, we had flows delivered around the dry reach into the central delta and flowing all the way down into the upper estuary and reconnecting with the sea, bringing birds and other wildlife back as that water reappeared on the landscape. And certainly we need to think about how the agreements that are reached with Mexico as our own post-2026 domestic agreements are reached. Do the agreements with Mexico create the space and the opportunity to continue those investments in habitat and flowing river? And in the spirit of Eric's aggressive incrementalism, I guess I would wonder if we might also be able to retool the system to have more of a perennial or at least seasonal flow reaching down through those bottom 100 miles of the Colorado River. You know, the climate crisis feels like we've been talking about it for years, right? And it's feeling like it's here. And I urge you not to forget that there's also a biodiversity crisis here. There's Cornell Ornithological Labs published a study a couple years ago documenting that since 1970, we've lost in the United States and Canada 30% of our birds. And if you don't care about birds, just remember that we live here too. So I guess let's not wait for 10 years for all those college graduates to work on climate change. Let's all of us figure out ways to lean in and attend to not just secure water supplies. That's a floor, not a ceiling. We need them, but we need to attend more broadly to the health of this space. And I'll end just by saying, please vote like you believe climate change is real. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. John Whiteside is here. John, do we have any questions from the audience?
I do, but I would like to introduce Nina Gruber. She has shepherded this Slido event. She trained all of us on a Zoom call. I think we owe Nina some respect by giving her some applause. Thank you. And secondly, I would like her to ask the next question.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody. So the top question right now is directed towards the Glen Canyon National Recreational Area. So Eric, but then anyone else, please feel free. Has the Park Service begun discussing with tribes what federal tribal co-management of the Glen Canyon National Recreation might look like?
I can't really speak for the Park Service. From some of the stakeholders that I've spoken with, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there in tribal coordination. And, you know, I will say that Glen Canyon NRA, it's dealing with a lot. I mean, the entire park is completely different than it used to be. They have budget constraints, they have resource constraints, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So I would leave it at that.
There's another ancillary question about that, and that is participation of youth. And I think, Jennifer, I agree with you. There is an army of activists on climate change issues before us. And so I think youth programs are here, but Rob, to be fair to Rob and NPS, maybe he would like to say something about that. But first, so let's answer the youth question and then let Rob defend himself.
What's the question?
How can we, besides integrating co-management of tribes with the national park, how can we co-manage the youth, especially tribal youth?
Be careful what you say, I guess. I don't know about the National Park Service. Perhaps you want to respond. I think there are a lot of things that we all personally share as values. And one of those, as I mentioned, is involving the youth. And I think there are a good number of opportunities, but I don't think we've put the investment into youth that we need to. And that doesn't mean the reason I'm struggling here is because I don't have all the answers, but maybe the young people have some of the answers about how to engage them more. So I don't know if that suffices to answer that question, but that's my response.
Didn't know I would get pulled into a panel discussion, but for the youth, for the Park Service, we've just pulled together multi-year funding proposals for IRA money, and youth program funding is a huge part of that, and especially tribal youth involvement. So we are just now trying to build that army with that money, truthfully. As far as, you know, how the Park Service is looking at tribal co-management, I would say that Eric is not wrong, that Glen Canyon National Recreation Area has had a lot to deal with in the last 2 years, as well as a transition in leadership. But Michelle Kearns, who's our new superintendent there, is very interested in that topic. I would say definitely, you know, she has been under fire, slammed with what we have had to deal with this past year. I think Ed Keeble, who's at Grand Canyon, has really stepped forward to have a lot of dialogue with tribes about co-management. He's had a little more time than Glen Canyon National Recreation Area has, and I think he's one of our leaders in trying to have that dialogue with tribes to see what that's going to look like for the future. I fully expect Michelle will step into those conversations more and more over time as she gets her feet under her, and hopefully things maybe stabilize a little at Glen Canyon for a while. We'll see. So I would answer it that way.
Thank you. So kind of jumping off of that concept of engaging the youth as one of the younger people, I guess, here, I want to maybe bring it back to Garrett a little bit and reference what you brought up as far as the Youth Council. And speaking beyond just NPS and such, how can other NGOs and advocacy groups continue to support something like a youth council, and what would the next steps be?
I think it begins with more dialogue and talking with the tribes and our tribal partners about what they have going on in their communities. And many of them have youth groups of different forms and fashions. But how can we ensure that we're taking what we're all talking about over the last couple of days to those young people and sharing knowledge, and then creating that as a gateway for them to explore their own ideas. One of the things I've spent a lot of time thinking about, or I thought about it and then not thought about it, is how to use technology to attract more engagement from young people in these issues. And like some of the others that have been up here, I'm not very savvy at that stuff, but that doesn't have to be my job or your job. If we make those connections and we create the spaces, for example, if we had a space here for more young people, and I know there's a number of students here, but creating those spaces and then having those conversations with them are going to open up those ideas. And I think there's a lot of us that are interested in that, and we just have to make that a priority amongst all the many priorities we have in dealing with the river.
So,
Live stream the conference on TikTok. They'll all tune in.
so there's a very popular question about the post-2026 management and how can we ensure there's an environmental voice in our approach for the new EIS?
We're trying. There's a lot of, there are many NGOs working to develop our own capacity, to make sure that we have the capacity to bring that voice to the table. I will say that while it does still feel like the environment is an afterthought, the capacity of the environmental groups to weigh in is very different than it was 20 years ago. We have our own modelers, we have our own scientists, we have our own communication specialists, so we will be making a full-throated effort, but honestly, we can't do it without the help from all of you and our constituencies. I know that the way Reclamation makes decisions about the Colorado River Basin is not necessarily something that we would call like democracy. We don't put it out for a vote. However, the more public demand there is for those outcomes, for environmental outcomes, I think the more they will be forced to pay attention and put some effort into those. At the same time, many of our, it's not just an advocacy effort or exercise. We know that Reclamation doesn't have all the answers, and we know the states don't have all the answers. So the Nature Conservancy and Trout Unlimited and Audubon and Western Resource Advocates, many, many environmental groups are engaging in these partnership projects that you've heard a lot about today and yesterday, where we are trying to set up the good examples, show what can be done with a little water and management, what can be done with an investment, so that when we get to making those big decisions, we can see where the opportunities are. And so we're hard at work, and you know, if anybody here is motivated, come join us.
Okay, I have a couple of questions referring to the recent Supreme Court decision. Any thoughts on how the Supreme Court's decision eliminating protection for half of wetlands means for the Colorado River Basin? And an additional question, what are the implications for ephemeral streams and what can be done in response?
Not a Clean Water Act expert. However, you know, at a sort of meta level, I say it puts certainly more burden on us to protect and restore wetlands that are connected, which aren't always protected, and we have lots of restoration opportunity. And I believe that it basically is now up to the states to figure out what their programs are going to be to protect or not the non-connected wetlands. And I know that there have been dialogues about that in at least Colorado and Arizona that I'm aware of, probably other states as well. And I think the outcome is yet to be determined.
I think I'd like to talk about the resiliency that Eric has noticed in Glen Canyon. As a river guide, I've seen it myself, that there is, nature is kind of making the adjustment, whether we help it along or not. And maybe we need to get in line with that. Do you have any further thoughts about the resilience you've noticed?
I think, you know, so much of what we talk about on the Colorado River is depletion and decline and scarcity. And I think in Glen Canyon, we have this one opportunity where we see something coming back. And I think it's inspiring and it's hopeful, and it should push us all to reconsider how we look at taming this river and where we store water. And if, there's not enough water to fill up Powell and Mead, we should look way outside the box and thinking about how to store it. And, maybe that means using Glen Canyon as a backup facility. Maybe it means looking at modeling for all these different alternatives that used to be off the table, but they really shouldn't be off the table anymore. If Glen Canyon hadn't been, for lack of a better term, propped up, it probably would have dropped below power pool last year. And it took a lot of effort from the agencies moving water from Flaming Gorge, holding water back from Flaming Mead, Lake Mead, and you look at the future post 2026, where is this river going to be in the decades to come? Is it just going to be kind of oscillating above power pool or dead pool? And is that good policy? And if, propping up Powell isn't going to work, and if despite best efforts, it falls below that, what comes next? And I think that has to be part of the conversation. And I think Glen Canyon's resiliency should hopefully be a part of the inspiration that something good can happen if you leave nature alone in certain places.
I'll just add, if we have one more minute, I think we've seen that resilience in the Delta as well. The trees grow even faster because it's even hotter. And it's just as sandy and silty down there. In fact, the entire Grand Canyon's worth of silt and sand was deposited in that alluvial floodplain and deltaic floodplain and creates that same growing substrate. The challenge there is that we let the whole thing dry out, turn to non-native, and now we have to not only do the hard work of manually restoring, clearing out the non-natives and planting the natives, but also securing the water to allow those habitats, those trees to thrive. I guess I wanted to say this at the beginning of my presentation, but I neglected to, 70% of all wildlife depends on riparian corridors and wetlands for some part of their life cycle. So we need it in all of these places.
All right. I must confess, when that panel started, I really wasn't sure where it was going to go. And now that it's over, I'm still not sure where it went, but it was all over the place. It was fun, and I'm pro-fun, so thank you. To prove that I'm pro-fun, I encourage you all to take a 30-minute break, and then we will have our final panel. All right, we are going to get started on our last panel. All right. There's always a little attrition before the last panel, so the diehards are here. That's great. This is a tradition we have here at this conference. At our last panel, we would always get together. We did it this way for 30 years. We'd always get together the very senior leaders in the basin and put them up there and ask them to give us some pearls of wisdom as to how we should move forward and solve the problems in the basin. And after a while, we kind of decided that's clearly is not working. So, then we decided we needed to find very young leaders who were ready to take on the challenge. And then we figured out, well, the sweet spot here is the mid-career professionals who have been through a few battles but haven't completely lost their ambition or their belief that we can do better. And so, I mean, that was the selection criteria, in case no one told you guys. So it was actually a little more complicated than that. And then we decided, let's subject is probably not the word that we decided to use. Let's treat these people to a moderator who has John Fleck, who has written a few books on the Colorado, including the first one, which was really optimistic. And I think if you wrote it again, it would not be so optimistic. But so he's been beaten down a bit, but he hasn't given up completely, and which is just, again, that perfect sweet spot for this panel. So John's going to do what John does, and then we're going to have some audience questions as usual. I think I'm going to be on the questions this time, so that'll be fun. John, you need anything else from me?
No, we're good.
Should I sufficiently poison the waters for you to get started?
Yeah. No, we're good. Although I'll point out he was polite enough not to mention that they have the old guy moderating the panel and the young, smart, talented people to answer the questions about the problems created by my generation.
Well, you can answer the question.
Yeah. So yeah. So I was the purpose of this panel is to kind of sum up and reflect on what we've heard. And I was watching the press gallery there yesterday afternoon and remembering my days as a journalist where, you know, you've been sitting through 1 or 2 days and your editor at like 3 o'clock, a couple hours before deadline, is like, what's the story, John? And it's like, you have to sum this up. And I think that's a really challenging thing, but we have a longer period of time and we don't have to throw this on anyone's driveway tomorrow morning. So the level of accountability is a little bit different. I would like to spend a couple of minutes going through what I think are some of the sort of key highlights that I heard, just sort of remind you of where we've been. And then I want to discuss with our panelists. I should introduce them. Crystal Tully-Cordova, doctor in all 3 cases. Crystal Tully-Cordova, principal hydrologist for the Navajo Nation. Elizabeth Kobolais, the University of Nevada, Reno, and John Berggren, all 3 doctors who's with Western Resource Advocates, all people who have been making their lives trying to sort out and understand the Colorado River. I appreciate their bringing their sort of expertise. And I want to remind you of where we are today and compare that to where we are a year ago when we gathered. So for those of you who were here last year, we held this conference 2 days after Reclamation Commissioner Camille Touton, I think, surprised many of us with her Senate testimony calling for a 2 to 4 million acre foot, suggesting a potential need for a 2 to 4 million acre foot cut in water use in the Colorado River Basin. And there was sort of this sense of shock, but the sense of shock was deeper, right? Like Powell had dropped earlier in the spring past 35.25, which was one of our
trigger points, Lake Mead, you all seen the pictures of the speedboats emerging from the mud. And it was a moment of significant crisis in the basin. Today, Powell's at elevation 3569 and change, almost 3570, so it's up 34 feet from a year ago when we were here. Lake Mead is up 7 feet. It's at 1054 elevation, which would have been viewed by us as a catastrophic bad level. And like after last year, it's like, good job. And I want to go back through some of the things that I noted that I heard over the last 2 days that I want to kind of plant in our mind as we have this discussion. Ali Afati, who's New Mexico's representative and trying to figure out these problems. Simple answer, there's a mass balance issue. There is more going out than coming in. That still applies, even though this year there's more coming in than going out. Brad Udall put that number on it, right? 1.5 million acre feet over time per year. We have what J.B. Hamby characterized as a historic accord in the new proposed lower basin agreement. We are still awaiting, as you heard from the upper basin panelists, a kind of judgment about what the analysis shows, so we don't have in any way unanimity across the basin. This is the plan we think we should follow, but at least it's a move in a proper direction. But we have to be mindful of Tom Bushatsky's comments that was a deal made under the sort of pressure of trying to avoid what he described as a litigation conflagration coming. So it's not like this happy deal, like we were trying to rescue something from disaster. We have heard a great deal of discussion, which I want to talk to the panelists about the question of equity across the basin. And we had also Tom Bushatsky, and I'm paraphrasing him here, no matter what all the pieces of paper say since 1922, every water user has to share in protecting the system, every single water user. We saw surfacing again a tension that has been with us for a long time. We saw J.B. Hamby talk about the importance of the upper basin meeting its compact obligation of the lower basin, and we heard Brad Udall, who I think we could characterize as an upper basin, one of us upper basin folks, talk about the legal problems and sort of value questions associated with that. We have heard a lot about values in many, many different ways. And I was really, really struck by the tension between the sort of tone of a lot of discussion about how Lake Powell and the reservoirs being so low being a bad thing, and Eric Balkan's slides of like this emergence of these rich and dynamic riparian systems that are just gorgeous, right? And so the question of the values that we're trying to pursue here in the basin are challenging ones. And then I really, I think before we get into the panel, I just have to remind us of Nora McDowell's words, which were, rich, far richer than I'm going to quote here, but her laugh line is worth repeating. If that river would speak today, what would it say? You guys pretty much screwed up. So we have just been through sort of watching this process of crisis management. And I would like to start off with our panelists by sort of talking about what we've learned from that exercise, what it can tell us about the changes we have made and have to make as we go forward with river management. And I'll let whoever wants to go first sort of.
I can go first. Is it on?
Hello?
It has a tape over it. Hello? Okay. So what I can say about a crisis is that we can't all sit around and wait for someone to take care of it. It's one of those situations where we can't look around for the parents or grandparents to get us out of the mess that we're in, but be able to rely upon ourselves. I don't know if many of you have moved to the transition to realize that you're the responsible party now. I don't know if you remember that within your lifespan, but it's kind of like a really, it's encouraging, but also scary at the same time, because then you think about, what's the best way, especially for unprecedented crisis, what is the best way to be able to address these challenges? Who do we need to be a part of the team? Because we know that we can't do it individually to be able to respond to the crisis at hand. And as we heard today, the system as a whole, the Colorado River Basin, is consistent of the upper and the lower. And so, it's like one arm can't do without the other, because they really need to be able to work together to be able to create the solutions that are needed to address the crisis at hand, while also concurrently addressing the long-term challenges for the future. Because we know that with the discussions that were had, the draft SEIS is only good for 3 years, all the way to 2026, and post-2026 is really the focus of our efforts. Why? Because it's for a longer time period. If we use 2007 as an example, 19 years, and so you think about, 20 years out, what are the type of black swan events that we may see in the future that we're not currently considering now?
Yes, I'll build on that too, in the this idea that you're part of the solution now, I guess. So I was in grad school for many years at CU studying studying the Colorado River and this topic, and with a lens on equity and sustainability. And so I spent many years thinking about equity and what that actually means. And I was really encouraged to hear at this conference how much people are talking about equity and how important equity is. But the challenge that I struggled with for many, many years, and it seems like we are struggling with, is what does equity actually mean, and how to define it. And I'm not going to try and define it, but I think there are ways of thinking about it where we could as a basin develop principles, things that every decision we make, whether it be short-term emergency operations or the long-term post-2026 guideline development, we should have principles embedded in evaluating those new policies. And so these principles include things like we've heard a lot last 2 days. We need to use less water, whether that's the 1.5 million acre feet or what Reclamation told us last year, the 15 to 30%. We need to use less water. Non-tribal uses need to use less water here in the basin. So that can be a principle. Whatever decision we're coming up with, whatever policy, does it help us as a basin use less water? Any new policies must recognize aridification and climate change, and that we are going to see less water in this river basin going forward. And do those new policies have the capacity to respond to a declining hydrology? I think big lesson learned from 2007. So can any new policies be flexible and proactive, recognizing that we're going to have less water? Healthy river flows must be maintained for irreplaceable environmental and recreational resources throughout the basin. As decisions are getting made, how do we ensure that healthy rivers are considered in those new policies? Something we've heard a lot is that the 30 federally recognized tribes need to be included. I think that's more and more agreed upon, and that principle is important for any decision-making process. And then in terms of the process, all decision-making forums need to have meaningful, inclusive collaboration and enable a broad range of input from impacted people, parties, and other stakeholders. So I'm not defining equity, but I think those are some good starting principles where all decisions being made can be viewed through that lens, and hopefully that helps create some of the more sustainable long-term policies that we've heard we needed in this basin.
Follow up for a second, because your thesis, folks who haven't read his thesis, it's like one of the most interesting analyses of how governance works in this basin. It's really good. It's kind of long, has the tedious nature of a PhD thesis, but he got the doctorate and the job, so it's good. So you've just given a description of sort of not necessarily what equity is, but what a process to move toward equity might look like. In what we have seen over the last year, or looking, with this sort of hair on fire agreement, we'll call it, or the DCP or the 07 guidelines, how close did those processes come to matching the sort of idealized framework going forward that you just described? Are there things we learned in what we've done in the past that we can do better going forward?
I'm still a little floored from Doug saying I'm mid-career and you saying my thesis was interesting. I think yes and no to answer your question. I think certainly there have been decisions that don't follow those principles, that weren't made in an inclusive way, that didn't consider declining hydrology, didn't include a broad input from sovereigns and stakeholders. But there's some good examples, and we've heard about them a little bit today, at least. The emergency operations over the last couple of years, how you can, if you're going to be releasing water, let's incorporate environmental values into those releases. Thinking to Eric Balkin's presentation, I want to connect Eric Balkin's presentation to something that Eric Kuhn said this morning, which was this idea, let's think outside the box and let's combine management of Lake Powell and Lake Mead as one system. And what does that get you? Well, maybe that gets you flexibility to take into consideration the values that Eric Balkin was talking about in Glen Canyon. So I think there's certainly examples, but I don't think we're anywhere there. I think Eric Kuhn did say that in terms of reservoir operations, we've done a pretty good job with this collaborative process, but the greater water use throughout the basin, some of these equity considerations, we're not there.
I think I'll pick up a little bit on your first question about this transition from the crisis moment to the post-2026 planning. And this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the last couple of years. And one thing that I was really heartened by listening to talks over the last couple of days is that it seems like everyone's ready to make that transition now. And that wasn't something that was apparent even a couple weeks ago, definitely not a couple months ago. So I wrote down things like JB Hamby said yesterday, we need to not focus on putting out the fires every day, and we need to focus on solving future longer term problems. Becky Mitchell said, we're all tired of moving from crisis to crisis. And to me, this is an exciting moment because we can reflect on some of the challenges with the SEIS process. And we can now sort of move beyond that. And I'm someone who thinks about kind of how institutions and rules guide the way we make decisions. And anytime we talked about the SEIS, that the original EIS, the 2007 process, what was sort of in the scope of that was always in the front of my mind. It sort of always constrained decisions. And then sort of the culture of 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were putting that together, was also constraining. And I think we've moved beyond that. We have all these new policy levers. We know we need to be more inclusive in this post-2026 process. And so that's sort of moving away from putting out the fire of the day to moving to the longer term thinking. It's really exciting to me that we're actually there. And I think that's one of the most resounding things that stood out to me about this conference.
So I want to follow up a little bit on the question of equity, which John raised, and we've heard it over and over again over the last couple of days, and it's been not terribly well defined. And it's one of those words like drought that we think we're talking about the same thing, and we in fact mean a whole bunch of different things by it. I'm not going to ask you all to define it, actually. I noticed the way John dodged that in his answer, but do we have the processes necessary? I was really struck, another one of the quotes that I have in my notes is Celine Hawkins' point about talking about tribal communities, free, prior, and informed consent with respect to tribal water agreements. and a related suite of legal mechanisms around tribal issues, but we also have a series of legal mechanisms in the basin that are the result of the exercise of various political powers that left out people in decision-making in a variety of ways, from the environment to tribes do we have the tools necessary? I'm not going to make you define equity, but as you think about equity and the processes around equity, do we have the tools? And we've heard all this discussion about equity to be equitable as we move forward. What do you all think?
I think it was Secretary Babbitt who said this morning that when we're thinking about equity, it's hard to define, right? You told us not to try to define it, but we can look at examples where we know there's been unfairness and unjustness, and that sort of helps me think about what tools we can implement to make these processes more equitable. So when I think and teach about equity, I kind of think about it in some different ways, like are people represented, right? Who's at the table? We've talked about that so many times this week. But then we also think about, do people have kind of equitable access to actually participate if they're at the table? And we know that hasn't always been the case. Even as new stakeholders have been integrated into our decision-making processes, they haven't always had the capacity. And so I was really excited to hear that in the environmental panel that NGOs are considering setting funds aside just to build capacity with tribes to be able to participate in some of the programs that they're promoting. Like that's a huge part of equity that we don't talk about when we just say who's at the table, right? Do we give everyone kind of the ability to actually participate? And then I think the sort of last part of that is, do the outcomes of the decision-making process actually reflect that representation and procedural equity component, I guess? So do kind of both the benefits and the burdens get shared in an equitable way among people who participated in the process? And I think when we think about equity in all of those ways, it's not just, who's at the table, it's how do we really empower people to participate in a way that's equal. And I think we're developing some of the tools for that that we haven't had in the past, like funding, capacity building for people to actually participate. So those might be some of the ways that we're sort of advancing it.
What I'd first like to start out with is the state of equity for tribes in the Colorado River Basin. When you have a large percentage Navajo Nation, upwards of 40% of the population that doesn't have running water, and you consider the state of the need for conservation in the Colorado River Basin, while concurrently also thinking about the need for development of water so that approximately 40% of residents, American residents, have the opportunity to be able to have sanitation as well as running water in their homes. I think it's important to understand that there's not equity in the basin, but speaking to your question about, do we have the tools necessary to be able to create equity in the basin? I believe we do. And there are numerous projects that are going on now to be able to improve water access. Closing the clean water access gap is an important factor with why tribes have such a desire to be able to resolve their water rights. And definitely the Navajo Nation is appreciative of the states that we have some resolved water rights in, while also, there's a need to be able to resolve other water rights. With regards to the unprecedented funding, CARES Act, ARPA, bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the IRA money, particularly right now, the Navajo Nation is using ARPA funding, a large chunk of its ARPA funding, to be able to do water development projects within the Navajo Nation. The Indian Health Service received $3.5 billion of federal appropriations under the bipartisan infrastructure law to be able to improve water access for not only tribal nation, but Alaska Native villages throughout the United States. And so, thinking about the opportunities that we have available through the federal appropriations, as well as, the opportunity to be able to think about programs that help another, there's existing programs like the San Juan Recovery Implementation Program that is to recover 2 fish species, the Colorado pike minnow as well as the razorback sucker. Why is it important to also have an understanding about that? When you think about ESA compliance and you think about water development, there's a need for being able to have ESA compliance while also doing water development. So also thinking about the unprecedented funding that is supporting those programs as well. And then also thinking about, post 2020, so that those programs, the San Juan River, as well as the Upper Basin Program, they go up to thinking about post 2023, they're authorized through Congress through September 2023. So thinking about the need for reauthorization of those programs and thinking about federal funding appropriations that go with those programs is something to also consider.
Follow up with that, Crystal, in what you've heard over the last couple of days, do you, and what you hear in your work in general with basin leadership, do you hear a willingness on the part of the basin leaders, the state and federal officials, to recognize the reality that even as water uses from the non-Indian users have to shrink, that there is a need for tribal communities that don't have water at all to develop and expand? Is that tension being explicitly thought about in the discussions that you heard and that you have a chance to participate in?
Yeah, so the tribes have been very vocal about the need to be able to close the clean water access gap, and that there's definitely a continued need for water development for purposes that protect health and safety. And the feedback we've heard from states as well as the federal government is to be able to support those efforts. How that is supported is yet to be completely fleshed out. But they are understanding, and I would dare say sympathetic to where we are currently at and the need to be able to address the closing the clean water access gap and the possible ways of being able to use some of the funding that is available to do that, but also thinking about, there's various levels. So Navajo Nation covers 3 states, if you may or may not know that: Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. There's varying levels of communication between the Navajo Nation and the states that we're in. With some states, we have a good working relationship, and they have an understanding about the need to be able to resolve some of the water rights issues in order to be able to create water security and sustainability within the Navajo Nation. But there are others that the crisis at hand really is taking up a lot of the time to be able to address the situation at hand. But I'm encouraged by the participation, especially with the Upper Colorado River Commission, to be able to be willing to have an understanding, to come to our homelands and be able to see, what our water challenges are, and also look at the opportunities for the future.
One of the quotes I wrote down in my note from my friend and colleague and collaborator, Eric Kuhn, he says a lot of reason for optimism in the basin from all 3 of you. Do you feel optimistic after what you've heard in 2 days and after what you've seen over the last year?
We were told by our communication staff not to use but that was very intentional. I think I am optimistic. Only because of where this conversation has ended up. I think, as Elizabeth was saying, even a few years ago, a lot of these things weren't on the table, and now they are, including this idea of equity and how important equitable solutions really are. And as I was thinking to your previous question, John, about what does that actually look like, or do we have the tools to do it? And I don't know, but the word I would replace with equity is empathy. And I think we're getting to a spot where we're empathetic of everyone else's values, viewpoints, and goals and desires when it comes to basin management. And so I think if we use empathy as that North Star, you look at some of the things that Crystal was just talking about, and you can't, help but be empathetic and understanding of the tribal needs in this basin. If you look to, there's been a lot of talk about future generations at this conference, and if you're empathetic to future generations, you have to come up with realistic solutions that adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change. We can't just talk about adaptation, but mitigation if you're thinking about future generations. Looking to some of the ecological needs in the basin, and if you think about empathy there, we have to do something. And so I'm optimistic that I think we're, as a collective, getting there. It's translating that into policy is the challenge. And I think if you use some of those principles I was talking about earlier, you get at that step. And I think we'll do that. I know in terms of the process, and Secretary Babbitt was talking about the architecture this morning, which I thought was really interesting. Set up the right architecture, the right process, and you get a much better outcome. And I know talking to folks at Reclamation, talking to some of the states, they're trying really hard to set up the architecture that is, will lead to a process that is, leads to more equitable or sustainable outcomes. And so I'm encouraged and optimistic. And I'll just end on that optimism note saying that if people like Terry Fulp are still in the room, I'm optimistic, so.
I think I'm leaving this conference, these 2 days, with more optimism than I came here with. And I think that's in part building on what John says. We're having conversations that we weren't having a couple months ago. I think when I was at CRUA in December, I was hoping we'd talk about managing the Colorado River Basin as a system and thinking about roles for 2 reservoirs. I was hoping we'd talk about managing allocations or distribution of water based on inflows or some average of inflows, and we weren't having those conversations, and we are now. And so I think that is something that is exciting to me. I think we are also thinking about new creative ways to continue to work together and build partnerships. And maybe that's part of this this architecture thing that Secretary Babbitt was talking about. I think that this is a really important opportunity for us to build long-term kind of institutional architecture and be able to rely on that when the crisis hits again. It's going to hit again. I think we're all of the mindset that, we're going to continue to experience greater variability in the Colorado River Basin. And if we can take this opportunity to work together to build some of that architecture and then to be able to fall back on it in times of need, then that makes me optimistic. I think the last thing I'll say is I have found it really amazing how humble everyone has been as they've reflected on the challenges of the last, especially 6 months in the basin. One thing that really struck me yesterday was when the basin states the principals and representatives were talking, there was some conversation about how they sort of lost sight of the real goal that they were trying to reach, right? They were trying to come to a point of figuring out how we stabilize reservoirs, but instead we all got kind of attached to, we need to come up with 2 to 4 million acre feet of cuts. And that sort of changed the whole process, right? And for me, I think about the fact that we're recognizing that we can go forward and think about, okay, what is our actual goal? Do we care about flexibility? Do we care about reliability? Do we care about consistency? Like defining that goal up front and being able to shape our processes around that is something that makes me optimistic. I'm excited to hear all of the sovereigns talk about process and figuring out a process to do this over the next 6 months before we just dive straight into the substance of these new policies, because I do think that that'll help us bring in more equity, more opportunities for sustainability, more opportunities for collaboration going forward.
I am optimistic. And I am optimistic because a lot has changed in the past 2 years with regards to increased and improved communication among many different parties between tribes and states, within the states themselves, with the feds in the states, with the feds and the tribes, and even with, conversations amongst the NGOs as well as NGOs and tribes. And building partnership has been a part of these conversations. I guess partnership has come as a result of building relationships. And these conversations that we've had with the unprecedented times, I don't know how many of you have had a college roommate or maybe a sibling to where real things didn't happen until you had conversations, candid conversations about really what your viewpoint was or what was really irking you about what someone else may be suggesting that you're doing wrong or whatever your perspectives are. When you have these candid conversations, and you can only have these candid conversations when you have more communication with one another rather than just seeing each other maybe periodically at a CRUA meeting or other meetings, having the candid conversations. And I have been in a meeting before where I have heard Colby speak very passionately, dropping some language to where, I knew what the challenge was. And so it's important to consider that as we have these increased communication and improved communications, we are better able to be candid with one another, to be able to lay out on the table everything. The challenges, the problems, the opportunities, even to tear apart the opportunities that may exist. Because I think, if any of you have ever done a science project, when you first did your science project, it didn't come out even though you thought your hypothesis was correct, it most likely didn't come out the way you thought it would. And so your first idea, it may not necessarily be the right idea, but through an action, through feedback from others. I'm just taking it back to the science fair. When you heard from the judges, like, what would you do differently if you were to do it again, is the opportunity to be able to think candidly with yourself. And I think, these relationships that we're building, like when I came here, I was optimistic. I was really excited to see all the people that I see on Zoom meetings, I see emails from, and I think, all of us are part of the solution, and I'm optimistic, especially knowing that this conference sold out and seeing how many people were online watching. Although regardless of what you might sometimes read in the media, like from the New York Times or the Washington Post on the East Side, they're not in the room right now and they don't really know. There's a lot going on that's going in a productive and positive way that may not necessarily be shown in the news reporting, but I'm glad some of our local news people are here to be able to get our stories out there about what we're actually doing to solve the problems that we're experiencing in the Colorado River Basin.
So I want to answer my own question about optimistic or not, because my attitude toward this question is mixed. As Doug noted, 5 years ago or whatever, I wrote an optimistic book. I think some of its optimism has not held up well. But one of the critical points that I made in the book was that for the thing that I optimistically described, which was this collaborative governance structure, to work going forward, it would have to continue to recognize, it was required of the communities of the basin to continue to recognize that we can all get by with less water. And what I saw in the chaos of the last year was states and individual water agencies retreating to defending rather than being willing to, as Tom Boshatsky put it, share in protecting the system with every single water user. And that left me really pessimistic. I again hear some of that in this room over the last couple of days. But really importantly, one of the things that makes me optimistic is three things that I think have really explicitly surfaced in the discussions here today, but also that have been talked about for years, but shoved off to the side in our discussions of what the problem solutions look like. And one is the tension in the lower basin between Arizona and California over California's seniority over the Central Arizona Project water. That question is now fully and publicly engaged. It's not in any way solved, but it's on the table in a very public way that we can no longer set it aside by having extra water. Similarly, you heard Eric Kuhn note in his analysis this morning that we are within 2 or 3 very dry years of reaching the point where the upper basin's delivery past Lee's Ferry drops below the tripwire that engages this conflict over what the meaning is in Article 3 of the compact about a delivery or a non-depletion, and how do we go about resolving that question. And I'm optimistic to hear those 2 things be talked about in a very public way, and I'm frightened because they're really hard problems to solve. And the third thing was really most explicitly shown by Celine's slide showing the allocated, the sort of legal entitlements that are unused of tribal water. And it's not clear to me that I see that we have the necessary processes in place in all this that we're talking about to really make good on that moral and legal commitment that we have to those communities. And I'm a little bit pessimistic about that, made more so by the fact that given that those water rights are unused, they're flowing into the system, they're being used by others, and we're now paying some of those others to not use that water. Well, the tribes never had a chance to use it in the first place. And I think those things are problematic. So I'm perhaps less optimistic about some things, more optimistic about other things. But, you know, like Eric, like we're going to do this, right? We'll figure this out. It may be painful over the next few years or the next 5 years or 10 years, but we'll figure it out, right? So let's turn to audience questions, Doug. You have some?
We have a fair number of questions here. I promised John that I'd just read the questions. I would do no additional add-ons here, but I must say now I know why people kind of feel a need to group and rephrase some of these because there's a lot of things that could be grouped together. So I'm going to partially honor my promise. A few of these I'll just read directly, but a few I'm going to group together and paraphrase. I really like this one that came in about, I feel that lower basin leaders remain in denial about the need for future significant cuts in use and wonder how we're going to deal with a river that's 8 million or 9 million acre foot river.
A question, but I'll sort of reframe it as a question.
There was a question mark at the end of the statement.
Okay, excellent. So my question would be, did it sound to you like the lower basin leaders are in denial? Any of you?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, so everything that I read and heard and people I talked to, the lower basin plan was a punt, but a punt on purpose to get us to the bigger, longer term solution at post 2026, where they would then, I think I've heard them say that's when we have the hard conversations. And so I don't think they're in denial of what needs to happen. What they're facing the reality of, we have to go back home and sell to our constituents that the reality that we have to use less water. So they're not in denial, I don't think. It's they're facing that political reality. And I think, and I hope that the lower basin plan starts that conversation, because now we're finally getting to the scale. 3 million acre feet, not the 2 to 4 million acre feet per year or the 1.5 per year, but that's the scale we need to get to. And I hope that plan is a stepping stone to that larger discussion of what we know, which is we have to use less water. How do we tell convince our constituents back home that that's what we have to do?
You don't have to.
I think you put it pretty well. I was trying to figure out how to phrase that. I don't know if denial is the right word, and maybe I get a little extra room to say that because I hail from Nevada, which has been characterized as the Switzerland of the Colorado River Basin, which I love. And I think we have really frank discussions about needing to limit water use in the rest of the lower basin, but we're also, we have the smallest allocation by far and have done a lot of work on conservation and efficiency. But I think even the question said 8 or 9 million acre foot river, right? And I remember having a conversation with John Ensminger where he said, we're talking about modeling a 9 million acre foot river, and other states in the lower basin might not even be able to kind of politically get away with modeling an 11 million acre foot river. And I think that's the crux of the issue and kind of what John was getting at. It's about that it's painful, and it's painful in a lot of ways. It's politically painful to navigate. And I think we're still trying to deal with those complex issues in the lower basin. But I think that is not necessarily denial of the need to reduce water use, reduce the structural deficit, come into compliance with lower basin allocations.
I just want to follow up with Elizabeth because John raised a really interesting point, which is something you may not even remember. You and I talked about when we first met when you were a grad student here at Boulder, which is in coming to terms with the reality of using less water, which is the challenge of the people who are on the negotiating teams, the kind of people we see here, coming to understand the problem at the basin scale and going back home and selling that or communicating that or working with a community of folks back home who just want to get their water, and the compact said they were entitled to it. So can you talk about that challenge as a sort of governance issue?
Yeah, I think I definitely remember that conversation. And we were kind of talking about your idea of the network in the middle. And to me, that sort of speaks to this idea that when you put a group of people together, you give them the opportunity and the resources to really be able to hash out some problems and some solutions, they probably will come to some common understanding. I think, we had a subset of sovereigns be able to do that at several points. We haven't been fully inclusive. I'm recognizing that, but that actually makes me sort of, again, kind of optimistic back to the last question, because it does seem like we've been able to get people on board with common ideas. And this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I've looked at cases like the Minute 319 case that we heard about from Jennifer, and the initial system conservation pilot program, which I think was a huge success in the basin. And then the challenge is, going back and figuring out how to get all of your constituents on board with that, because it's for us, when we're dealing with these issues every day and meeting face to face with our colleagues and having conversations and getting to know each other, I think, we do have the potential to really reach some agreement, even if it's tough. It's much harder to do with people who don't know where their water comes from, doesn't understand how water, how water's distributed across sectors in the basin, all those sorts of challenges. And maybe that's a communication challenge on our part. Maybe that is a governance challenge. It's great that we have all of these different institutions and levels of governance in the basin dealing with problems at kind of the scope that they occur, but we might need some more coordination between all of those levels and collaboration between all of those levels to really address basin scale problems. So maybe this network group in the middle is one level of that, but it's certainly not going to solve the problems on its own, right? So that's the place where we hit a wall, maybe run into some challenges.
All right. This is one where I'm going to have to group it a little bit and rephrase it a little bit, John. So there's a lot of questions here that really pushing on this issue of exactly what is the mechanism that we need to develop to get to meaningful tribal involvement in the negotiation of these rules. And And I'm kind of on board with all these people. We've talked all whole conference about the need to do it. There's been no one objecting to that. But there's been very little talk about very specific mechanism. What is the mechanism? And I know you've all touched on it before. Sorry, John, I'm taking your job. Well, you've all touched on this issue in a general way of the reforms that need to happen. Can anyone go a step further and talk about specific mechanisms for more meaningful tribal engagement in this negotiation upcoming and beyond?
Thanks for the question. Definitely participation can be improved with formalized processes. And example of that was what was in the Drought Response Operations Agreement, Section 7.2, specifically participation of Upper Basin tribes within the DROA framework that would then proceed to be in the following DROA plans from 2002 was included in 2022 and 2023. So thinking about ways for formalizing participation, particularly within the documents itself, I think is opportunity for tribes to be able to participate as we think about the post-2026 framework and what can be that it can be inclusive of is, an invitation, because I think it's not going to be forced participation, right? There's a difference with invitation for participation because, to speak frankly, some tribes have the capacity to be able to participate and others do not. Or, there may be other pressing priorities that they have to deal with. And so by participating and formalizing a process similar to DROA, I think is an opportunity. I know there has been increased tribal representation at the state level. So for California, for Colorado, for Utah, and thinking about those efforts, it's great, right, to be able to participate in a formalization of process there. But I think, with regards to the conversations between the Upper Colorado River Commission and the Upper Basin tribes, there's opportunity to formalize the process. Maybe that process doesn't necessarily look like a tribal representative on the UCRC. Maybe it looks like something different, just formalizing the communication between the entities so that regardless of the people who may be in positions at that time, right now it works. The conversations that we're having, particularly in the Upper Basin, because of the people who are currently in those positions. But what formalizing the process can do is weather the test of time. Not only the administrations that might change with the post-2026 efforts, who knows who comes after Biden? And when we think about, who knows who comes after Becky Mitchell, Gene Shawcroft, Brandon Gephardt, and Esteban Lopez, when we think about formalizing the processes, it won't just be dependent on, the people who are in the room, but really be a part of the formalized process.
Could you just really elaborate on how the participation worked? Like what was actually asked of Navajo Nation? What did you do?
So what Navajo Nation has the opportunity to do as part of Section 7.2 as participation in the DROA is to participate in the working groups that describe all the technical aspects of, describing if an emergency releases will be occurring from Flaming Gorge, from Blue Mesa, or from Navajo, or even the conversations, that put out in the 2023 Drought Response Operations Plan with regards to recovery. So it's really a part of the decision-making process. And as I heard yesterday from, Tom from Arizona was really, if there's opportunity, at least from Arizona's perspective, to be able to be a part for tribes to participate in the decision-making process, that he seemed to be supportive of that, to where, ultimately it would be great if we were, some of the main people. Granted, we weren't signatories in the 1922 compact, nor was Mexico, but to be a part of the decision-making process is definitely a step in the right direction.
I was just going to add to that, that institutional inertia is a serious thing, and it's really hard to change institutions. And I think the way you do that is intentional formalization, like Crystal's just been talking about. You can't just kind of do an ad hoc or informal process and expect that to last and to buck the trend of your existing institutions, especially when you get into things like emergency operations, because you'll just rely on those existing institutions. So finding a way to formalize it so that through changes in administrations, through change in state representatives, through drought years, through bad years, that's institutionalized so that we can't revert to just going back to the dark room and the basin states come up with an agreement. So that doesn't answer Doug's question of whether it's a specific mechanism, other than I would say we have to formalize it to break that institutional inertia of how it's been done for 100 years, 100+ years.
And I would just add that I think now's the time to discuss these mechanisms and formalize them to the extent that we can, because it's really hard to build sustainable and resilient institutions and processes when you're in a crisis. And I think, we are lucky to be able to capitalize on this good winter snowpack. We're lucky to be able to capitalize on some recent negotiations and other things that have given us a little bit of breathing room. I also would say that I think the most specific mechanism that I heard talked about was this idea of like a 38 sovereign table with the 7 basin states, the federal government, and 30 tribal representatives. And I think maybe an ultimate decision-making table that looks like that will be a good idea, but I probably wouldn't go as far to say that anytime the 7 basin states meet, that everyone needs to be in the room. I also wouldn't say anytime the tribes meet that the 7 basin states need to be in the room, right? I think there are benefits to having sort of an informal structure where different groups come together and have conversations and get to know each other and have common interests and build solutions together, and then ultimately bring them together, right? We've seen a lot of processes that have had these very successful working groups that can kind of feed up ideas, but for that to work, the decision-making level has to take that structure seriously, and that's sort of what we can formalize right now.
All right. This one's a little tricky. There's a couple ways to group a few of these questions, but we're getting a lot of questions that talk about, while in the conference, we're talking about the supply-demand imbalance in the river, and that's what we're mostly talking about. But the thread running through all the discussions is also climate change and this problem of climate change, and it's more than a water problem. It creates other problems as well. And there's a lot of questions about, as we talk about and make efforts to solve our water problem in this basin, should we also simultaneously or in some coordinated way be talking also about what we can or should do to solve this root problem of climate change? And one, in this part, I'll honor my deal. I'll just read this part as an example of these questions. Realistically, temperatures will continue to rise for as long as we are dependent on fossil fuels. How can we include carbon reductions in our Colorado River calculus?
The way I think about that, in what was a kind of eye-opener for me a couple of years ago, was when we started talking about post-2026, and it would be a new interim agreement, much like the 2007 guidelines were. And I had heard numbers like it's probably going to be 20 or 30 years. Maybe that will be the length of this new interim agreement for the post-2026 guidelines. And I was thinking about that. In 20 or 30 years from 2026, that's mid-century. What are all the climate projections you hear from Brad Udall and others? Things get really bad at mid-century because of climate change. So to that point, we have to start thinking about carbon emissions and mitigation in all of our decision making. And Mike Cohn has made this point quite a bit, that our water providers, our water utilities are in some cases pretty massive operations in enterprises, and everything they should be doing, because it's their business of selling water, should be focused on reducing carbon emissions, whether that's electrifying fleets, thinking through renewable energy options, whatever they can do to reduce their carbon emissions is essential. It's not going to fix climate change by any means, but it's demonstrating that they have skin in the game. They know how real this is. And we have to think about that as we make decisions throughout the basin and get folks on board. I mean, we have to. I think there's no other way around that. So just to add to Jennifer Pitt's last comment, like vote like you believe in climate change, vote like you believe that we need to do something about climate change and we need to reduce our carbon emissions dramatically.
I'd just add that I think we actually have some opportunities here to think about climate change more broadly and try to solve our water problem. So I think about, we're potentially asking people to participate in voluntary programs to temporarily fallow their fields, or we heard a little bit about permanent buyouts of water rights, then maybe those are opportunities to transition to places where we can build solar arrays or do other kinds of renewable energy development. And I think that we should be thinking a little bit more broadly than just water when we're thinking about the future of the basin. I was thinking during the agricultural panel when we were talking about crop switching, I spend a lot of time talking to farmers in rural areas, and I know that switching your crops is just not as easy as putting a new type of seed in the ground. You need new technology and new equipment and all these other new things. And, are those sorts of investments things we can do with drought mitigation funding? Because in the long term, they do contribute to basin-wide sustainability. Is maybe renewable energy investment something we're thinking about down the line? I think that it's a tough challenge, but these things are so interrelated that we can't ignore and separate water issues from climate issues in the Western US.
And what I'll close with is, one thing I'm glad that we're not continuing to debate is whether or not climate change is real. So we've gotten over that little obstacle, but at the same time, I think having an understanding about the climate change impacts on hydrology is something that is variable. And as we heard from Brad Udall and others, there's variability with regards to hydrology. And so when we think about the policies and operating guidelines that need to be able to support a variable hydrology, it's important to consider policies that are adaptable to be able to address what Mother Nature gives us and be able to not be based on fixed numbers. As we saw the variable tables and graphs, we see that, it's varied over the past century and will continue to vary into the future. And the only way we can be able to create mitigation strategies is to be able to have adaptable policies.
John, was I to understand from your voguing there that you want one more question? Okay. I'll combine a few again, because I think this makes for a good ending point. This is kind of the, if you were in charge of the world here, what is the one thing you would really most like to see in the post 2026 rules, and either in terms of what's in the document itself or the process used to get there? And there's a similar question about if you could rewrite the compact, what it would look like. But I think these are related things. And I don't think you should probably limit yourself to one thing, but a short prioritized list of, if you were in charge, what would you really want to see come out of this next round of discussions?
What I'd like to see out of the post-2026 framework is really a better understanding of impacts. I think, the impacts from the 2007 interim guidelines were pretty limited to where having an understanding of the impacts when you think about not only the nexus of water, energy, and food, the impacts when you draw that net out there, the impacts to stakeholders as a result of the operating guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead are far reaching than what was described in the 2007 interim guidelines. And what I would like to see is the post-2026 framework be able to be, cast that net wider than it has been casted in the past.
All right. So some things I think about that I would like to see post 2026. I have some things that are a little bit more detailed that have come to my mind, and then things that are a little bit broader. But I think this idea about flexibility and adaptability is so important. I try to make the point that climate change is a more variable future all the time. I mean, I'm someone who studies drought and talks about how we need to manage drought all the time. And I live in Northern Nevada and we're under a flood emergency measure right now because our snowpack's melting so quickly. So figuring out how to be as flexible as possible and adapt, I think is kind of a core idea. And there are lots of mechanisms that have been talked about to do that sort of thing. So making allocations based on a rolling average annual flow at kind of an extreme end, thinking about water allocation more as like shares or percentages of that rolling average annual flow. We have a basin in Nevada that's experimenting with that right now with groundwater withdrawals that I think is really interesting and inspiring, and is helping us think about how we can do things like respect the institutions of prior appropriation by giving senior users larger shares, while also creating a system that allows us to avert, in this case, collective drawdown of groundwater. So I think there are some specifics that, it's not necessarily those mechanisms, but it's those types of mechanisms that allow us to continue to be flexible to these increasingly variable conditions. So I think that that's something I'd really like to see. I alluded to this before, but I think one of the most important things I'd like to see is some sort of more formal coordinating structure. Mark Splotchy referred to the Great Lakes Commission earlier, and there's something I think of too, not because of the specific way they have chosen to manage or allocate their water, but in part because they have a sustained funding stream and they think really hard about how to coordinate the use of that funding. And we have a historic amount of funding coming into the Colorado River Basin right now, and not as much coordination or inclusive coordination around that. So I think, that doesn't mean we take away anyone's current institutions, organizations, decision-making powers. I kind of think about it as this like institutional layering. Like, can we come up with a new layer that sort of looks at the basin at this high level and could do things like manage sustained funding, because we've heard the need for that over the last 2 days. And while we have a big chunk now, it's not going to last long. So how do we think about those sorts of things into the future? So those are just a couple things I'm thinking about for post-2026.
I think the things that I would like to see are, and we'll probably learn a lot next week with the notice of intent, but just expanding the scope beyond just reservoir operations. I think that's essential. We've learned that if we, as a basin, just focus on reservoir operations, we get ourselves in some of the situations we've seen over the last couple of decades. So expanding that scope, recognizing this is a connected river basin, it's not just two large reservoirs. And if the post-2026 guidelines do anything, just expanding that scope of how we think about the basin, I think would be really essential. And the other thing I would add is some level of the guidelines, new guidelines being proactive. I think it seems like we've been in a real reactive mode with our decision-making, with our policies. The 2007 guidelines are based on tiered levels in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and when X tier is hit, we get why shortages. It's kind of a sluggish system that responds to hydrology. Can we be more proactive? Can we get ahead of declining hydrology such that we're not in this constant crisis reactive emergency mode where we get things like people revert to their existing decision-making processes in dark rooms and make emergency decisions. And how I think about that is if we're not in that crisis mode and we are more proactive, we have a better ability to take into consideration ecological values. Maybe then we have sufficient flows and timing of flows in the upper basin for endangered fish. Maybe then we can think about different ways of managing the Grand Canyon and releases from Glen Canyon. Maybe then we can think about Glen Canyon itself. And maybe then we can think about more regular flows in the Delta or a healthier salt in the sea. I think if we're not in that crisis reactive mode, we're more proactive, we're ready, we know what's coming, we're better prepared, we can think more holistically.
Panelists. And before we hand it over to Doug, I would just like to thank Doug.
All right. I just need one more minute of your time, and I just want to say a few thank yous. I want to thank all our presenters, not just this panel, but the whole crew. Some organizations, some conferences pay their presenters, and we don't pay our presenters. You do this, right? We don't pay our presenters, but we get the best and the brightest, and I'm thrilled by that. The other thing is when people talk to me about the conferences we have here, I always tell them I think we do the best conferences. And obviously it's not like I'm impartial here, but the logic I give is because I don't know any place that has conferences with audiences who are as good as the ones we get. And I'm not doing the pandering thing here, because if I was pandering, I would have done this 2 days ago to sweeten you up. But all the people that spoke at this conference, if they didn't exist, I could sit here and pick out an all-star lineup and just recreate a really excellent conference just from the people that are in this room as attendees. And so I want to thank all of you I know you all have better things to do, but or at least equally as good things to do. So I'm just thrilled that you all show up, and I do appreciate it. I want to thank all our sponsors, because otherwise we just get crushed financially doing this sort of thing. So thanks for sponsors. I want to thank, is Annie, are you still over there somewhere? Annie? Okay, we all know Annie by now. So Annie's new to the university. She's new to our center. And this is basically her first project that she did when she got here, is this conference. And she got here late in the game of planning a conference. It was a brutal welcome. And I've told her, because I was just so fearful the last 2 months, that she would just say, screw it, and walk away and do something else. Well, I told her, it'll get easier. And it gets easier in about 2 minutes, so hang in there. So thank you. And Nina, of course, is the Water and Tribes Initiative side equivalent here. And then I want to thank my partners in the Water and Tribes Initiative. I've gotten a lot of credit for this event, and thank you, I appreciate that. But this was organized by myself, by Daryl and Matt McKinney in the Water and Tribes Initiative. And I got to tell you, working with Daryl and working with Matt has driven me nuts at times, because they are so ambitious. The best example being that tribal panel yesterday of 15 people. And I kept saying, guys, you cannot have a panel with 15 people. And they kept saying, oh, we'll make it work. It'll be great. It'll make it work. And they made it work, and it was great. So I appreciate you guys. The ambition that drove me nuts, but was actually really what I needed. And so finally, one thing, it's been a weird week for us around here, in that we're doing a conference the same week we're remembering Charles Wilkinson. And I haven't said anything about it, but I knew Charles for 30 years. He was a good man. I miss him. I just want to encourage you, those of you that knew him, to keep sharing your memories about him. And remember that the work he did so well is still not done. So we got work to do. Let's continue to do it. That's where I want to end. Thank you. Safe travels.